I never put much stock in the old stories about skinwalkers or other things people talk about in our area. They were just stories. My friends and I used to laugh about it, making jokes and getting a little creeped out when we drive past certain spots in the woods, but I never really believed in anything supernatural. Still, there was always something about the place by the bluff that felt off. A place surrounded by those stories, where strange things were supposed to happen. I didn't think much about it at the time, but after that summer, I'll never forget it. It all started one late night around 1 a.m. when we decided to check it out. It had been a hot summer, and we'd been driving around all evening looking for something to do. We were bored, so we took a chance and headed out to the bluff. We knew it was off limits, blocked off by a fence that had only one place to get through, and I was the one who knew how to sneak in. It was a tight space, a gap in the fence that barely allowed our truck through, but I had done it before. Everyone was half asleep, it was late, and honestly, we were just out for a thrill. The drive was rough, full of bumps and turns. It was already too dark to see clearly, but there was something about the place that didn't feel right. Even before we passed through the gap in the fence, I had this strange feeling in my gut. You know the kind that doesn't make sense, but sticks with you anyway. I was used to it, but this night, it hit differently. As soon as we crossed into the area, I felt a chill. I looked over at my buddy, who was half asleep in the passenger seat. The bumps in the road must have woken him up, and when he looked around, his face went ghost white. He wasn't even making a sound, but I could tell something was off. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. I asked him what was wrong, but before he could even answer, he gasped, his breath catching in his throat. He looked terrified. I didn't say anything at first, but when he muttered, "We need to leave now," the panic in his voice got to me. I wasn't about to argue. We'd been out there for maybe 20 minutes, and whatever was going on, I wasn't going to stick around. So we turned around and headed back through the gap in the fence. But when I looked over at him again, his eyes were locked on something far away, something up on the hill. He wasn't looking at me, but it's something in the distance. I asked him what he saw, but he didn't respond. After a few moments, we got the truck moving, and as we drove away, he finally spoke again, almost like he was waking up from a daze. I saw a little girl. She was running up the hill. I don't know how to explain it. His voice was low, shaky, and I could tell he wasn't lying. He wasn't one to joke around, especially not when it came to stuff like this. He went on to describe the girl, how she was in a white dress and seemed to be running fast, too fast. But when we passed the hill, there was no sign of her. Nothing. I didn't know what to think. I wasn't about to call him crazy, but I wasn't convinced either. Maybe he had just woken up and imagined it. Or maybe the darkness and the isolation had started to mess with his head. Still, something about the way he talked about it stuck with me. It unsettled me, but at the time I shrugged it off. There was no way I was about to let some half-dreamed-up story stop me from going back. A couple of weeks later, the same group of friends and I went out again. This time, minus the friend who saw the little girl. It was getting dark, but not too late, and I wasn't feeling that uneasy yet. The sun had just dipped behind the hills, leaving the place in shadows. It was quiet, too quiet. We started the hike down the hill, the ground uneven and full of clefts that made it hard to keep our footing. The air was thick, damp with the summer heat and the smell of dirt. I felt a little more comfortable than I should have, like maybe the stories were just that, stories. Nothing real. But as we got further down the hill, a sound caught my attention. At first, it sounded like a dog, maybe a coyote, but there was something off about it. It wasn't the usual howls or yelps we'd hear around here. It was more guttural, like something trying to mimic a dog, but failing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My friend, who was ahead of me, noticed it too. He stopped looking around, his eyes scanning the trees. We both turned to head back up the hill to the others. That's when I saw him. A man, standing exactly where we had just been. Just standing there, looking at us. It was so sudden, so out of place that for a split second, I thought I was imagining it. But no, he was there, and he wasn't moving, just watching us. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but there was something unsettling about him. He didn't look like he was lost or looking for help. He just looked off. I didn't even think to ask my friend if he saw it too. I didn't need to. He was already moving quick back to the others, and I followed. We didn't stick around after that. We turned the truck around and left, not saying much, just driving. I kept glancing back at the road, half expecting to see him still standing there, but he was gone. But then, the next time, the fear was real. We went out that night with more friends. A different group this time. The night had fallen completely, and the darkness felt thicker somehow, like it was pressing in on us. We were just messing around, driving a lifted truck and rock crawling through the rough patches of the terrain. I was sticking my head out the window, helping the driver spot rocks and trees, making sure we didn't get stuck. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious, just a little adventure in the dark. Then it happened. A scream. A blood-curdling scream. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't anything human. I can't even describe it right. It wasn't just loud. It shook me deep inside. I heard it clear as day, right in my ear, like it was right next to the truck. I yanked my head back in and looked around, asking if anyone else had heard it. Everyone was quiet, and they all looked at me like I was crazy. No one else had heard it. I tried to convince myself it was just in my head, that I'd imagined it, but I couldn't shake it. I couldn't get the sound out of my mind. Later that night, when we were all back at the house, the driver came up to me. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He asked me if I had heard a scream earlier. I didn't know what to say. I nodded and he went on, telling me that he had heard the same thing. Not exactly the same, but close. It had been faint, like it was far off, but it was unmistakable. That was enough for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something that didn't belong. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a person or something else. But after that night, I never went back to that place. It's been months now, and every time I think about it, I feel that same fear creeping in, that same chill. I don't know what we disturbed that night, or if we were meant to be there, but I don't think I'll ever go back. I've been dealing with sleep paralysis for about a year now. I know it's not exactly rare. People experience it all over the world, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying. I don't get the usual shadowy figures that a lot of people talk about, or the sensation of someone standing at the foot of my bed. No, for me, it's more personal. It happens mostly in the afternoons when I'm slouched on the couch, too tired to do anything but nap. It's the worst feeling in the world to be fully awake and aware, but your body is still asleep, refusing to respond to any command, no matter how hard you try. I didn't always have these episodes. It started last year, and it came without warning. I thought I was just tired at first, like maybe I hadn't gotten enough sleep the night before. But then it kept happening again and again, always during the same time of day, a nap in the middle of the afternoon. It didn't matter where I was either. Sometimes it would happen when I was lying down in bed, and other times on the couch, usually with my toy poodle curled up next to me, but always when I was slouched in a way that made it harder to move. I don't know how to explain it, but the paralysis itself feels like this deep, suffocating weight pressing down on you, just as if someone is sitting on your chest. I can't move my arms or legs, and even though my mind is completely alert, my body feels like it belongs to someone else, like it's still asleep, deep in a dream, trapped somewhere between two worlds. I try to move my fingers, wiggle my toes, anything to get my body to react, but it never works. I can't speak either. It's a helpless, panicked feeling, not being able to do anything but lie there, trapped in my own skin. During these episodes, my thoughts race. I know the moment I start to feel that heavy weight settle in, I'm about to go into paralysis. But this time, it's different. This time, I feel the familiar pressure settling over me, and I can't shake the panic that comes with it. My heart starts to pound in my chest, and my breathing gets heavier, though I can't control it. I'm wide awake, but my body isn't listening. And that's when I hear it, the soft thud of little paws hitting the couch. I'm too disoriented to recognize what's happening at first. But as soon as I hear it, I know it's my poodle. She's always been a little weird about being too close when I nap, especially on my stomach. I would sometimes coax her into lying down there by holding her close, gently wrapping my arms around her as she tried to squirm away. She doesn't mind being snuggled next to me, but when I try to get her to stay on my stomach for too long, she just hops off and walks away. She doesn't listen when I call her to stay put, either. It's like she knows I'm not really in control when I'm napping like that, and it makes her restless. But now, In the midst of this paralysis, I hear her bark. And not just a single bark, but a sharp, urgent one. A bark that seems so out of place for a dog that's normally so quiet and laid back. Then, without me having to call her or even move, I feel her little body hop onto my stomach. She's not fighting to get away like she usually does. She just stays there, still, as if she's chosen to lie down against the pressure of my body. I can feel the warmth of her body against mine, which is almost comforting, but it also sends a jolt of panic through me. It's not like her at all. I try to move my hands to lift my arms to pet her or nudge her off, but nothing happens. My body is still frozen in place, and I can only lie there, my eyes wide open, unable to look away from the wall ahead of me. My heart starts racing even faster now, and a part of me wonders if I'm still dreaming, if this is just a bad nightmare playing out in my head. And that's when I realize something. She's staring at the wall, not at me, not even at the room around us. Her little head is tilted slightly, her eyes locked on something beyond my line of sight. I can't see what she's looking at, but I feel the weight of it. A presence. Something is there, I just know it. It's like a chill creeping up my spine, a subtle awareness that something is wrong. I feel the tension in my chest growing tighter as I desperately try to scream, to do anything, to break free of the paralysis and call out to her. But no sound comes. For what feels like an eternity, we're just like that. Me frozen, her completely still, eyes fixed on the wall. I start to feel a growing sense of dread, and my mind races with all the things I've heard about sleep paralysis. The shadowy figures, the feeling of being watched, the sensation of something lurking just out of sight. I've read about it all, and now, in this state of helplessness, it's like my mind is looping through every scary thought I've ever had. The air feels thick and heavy, and I can almost smell something faint, like the dust and stale air that collects when you leave a room too long. It's almost like I'm being suffocated, not just by the weight of my immobile body, but by the oppressive atmosphere in the room. The fact that my dog is still staring at the wall, unblinking, doesn't help. Her usual calmness is gone, replaced with something else. It's almost as if she knows something I don't. I feel the panic rise in my chest, a wave of raw fear flooding through me. What if she knows what's on the other side of the wall? But then just as quickly as it started, the paralysis begins to lift. I feel the pressure on my body lessen, and my limbs start to regain some sensation. It's a slow, creeping return, like waking up from a deep, oppressive sleep. As I start to regain control of my body, I let out a shaky breath and blink rapidly, trying to clear the fog that's clouding my vision. The room looks exactly the same as it did before, but everything feels different now. My dog, still on my stomach, finally seems to snap out of whatever trance she was in. She shakes herself, blinks, and looks at me with those big brown eyes, as if nothing happened at all. I don't know what it was that she saw, or if she was just as trapped as I was, but I can't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was just another moment of my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just the sleep paralysis messing with my perception. But even now, as I sit here writing this, the memory of her staring at that empty wall, so still, so focused, sends a chill down my spine. I haven't had another episode like that since, but it's hard to forget the feeling of being trapped, of having no control over your own body, and the unsettling presence that lingered in the room that afternoon. Maybe it was just my mind playing on my fears and the stories I've heard about sleep paralysis. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something else there, something that only my dog could sense, something that we both experienced together. But whatever it was, I'll never forget the way my poodle looked at that wall, or the way my body felt, paralyzed and helpless, with her watching something I couldn't see. It was one of those nights when the world feels a little too quiet, like it's holding its breath. The streets of a small town we lived in were mostly empty, except for the occasional car passing by in the distance. We had just finished hanging out at a late-night diner and decided to walk around. The kind of walk where you just keep your feet moving and let your mind wander. It was around 3 a.m., well past when anyone with any sense would be out. But we were all tired of the usual things to do, and the night was too still to let go of the feeling that something could happen. My friends and I wandered toward the old market square, which, by the way, wasn't exactly a place you'd expect to find anyone at night. During the day, it was a buzzing area full of street vendors, tourists, and the usual noise. But at night, it was a ghost town. The vendors packed up, and the whole place felt abandoned. There was this one stand, a tiny stall where the owner sold hand-carved trinkets and cheap souvenirs, always closed up tightly by sundown. I didn't know much about him, but every time we passed by, I always noticed the stall's owner, a man who never seemed to sleep. He was always there in the daytime, talking quietly to customers, almost always in the same tattered jacket, and always seeming off. I never gave it much thought until that night. We were a group of 4. Me, Sarah, Tom, and Lindsay. We were all tired from the late hours, but we still had that kind of restless energy you get when you're half asleep and half awake. It was Sarah who suggested we stop in a market square for a while. The air was cool, and we found ourselves walking around the closed booths, half hoping something exciting might happen. Lindsay, the most reckless of us all, had the idea that she could sneak behind one of the stalls and change. She was always the one to make decisions like that, spontaneous, daring, but never really thinking things through. She got into the habit of changing clothes at random times, and that night was no different. The stand was empty, and its walls were covered in heavy curtains that blocked the view from the outside. It seemed like the perfect place for her to slip behind, out of sight. We didn't think much of it. We all turned away, chatting idly among ourselves, when suddenly we heard a scream. The kind of scream that cuts through the air and makes your blood run cold. Lindsay's scream. We turned around immediately. In the dim light of the street lamps, there was this man standing perfectly still at the edge of the stall where Lindsay had been changing. He had just emerged from what seemed like thin air. I can't even explain how he appeared. One moment there was nothing, and the next he was right there. It was like he had materialized out of the ground. He wasn't tall, maybe in his late 30s, wearing a dirty button-up shirt that looked too big for him. His face was pale, almost sickly looking, with dark circles under his eyes. His expression was completely unreadable. No emotion, no expression at all. Just this strange calmness that didn't fit with the situation. At first, we all froze, staring at him. It felt like time stopped for a second. Then, without a word, the man began to move. Not quickly, just slowly, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't run or approach us, just took a step back into the stall, like he was retreating to some unseen space behind it. And then, just as silently as he had appeared, he vanished behind the curtains, which rustled lightly as he disappeared. I felt a tight knot in my chest. My heart was pounding in my ears, but there was no time to process anything. We were all staring at each other, unsure of what we had just witnessed. It was so surreal, it didn't feel real. A man, out of nowhere, walking out from a stall that shouldn't have had any space for someone to hide in, especially not someone living there. Lindsay was still in shock, and she hadn't moved from where she was crouching, hidden behind the stall. Tom took a few steps forward, unsure of what to do. Sarah looked like she was about to burst into nervous laughter, but it didn't come. She just stood there, shaking. We all glanced at each other, processing what we had just seen. None of us spoke for a long time. I don't even know why we didn't just run, but somehow we were all rooted to the spot, staring at that closed-up stall. That feeling of unease crept deeper. Something wasn't right. After a while, the silence was broken by the soft scraping sound of the metal shutters. The man was slowly pulling them down again. It was then that I realized something. He wasn't just retreating into the stand, he was locking it up again. From the inside. And then it hit me. He was living there. That tiny stall, packed with trinkets and little knickknacks, was his home. We stood there, stunned and paralyzed, watching as he finished securing the stand, locking it tightly with a chain. And then he disappeared entirely, out of sight, into a place that none of us could have imagined. The thought that someone was living inside there, hidden away in plain sight, made my stomach turn. It was so unsettling. We didn't know what to do. We couldn't just leave Lindsay behind to finish changing, not after what we had seen. But we also couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It was as if the entire square had become a trap, and we were the prey. The night had taken on a different quality, darker, heavier, and we didn't even want to breathe in case it made too much noise. Eventually, Lindsay emerged from behind the stand, her face pale and her hands shaking. She didn't say anything. She just walked past us, not looking at any of us, as though she couldn't believe what had just happened either. We all followed her, our footsteps the only sound that filled the empty market. It felt like the man's presence was still there, lingering, like the air itself was filled with something wrong. By the time we reached the end of the market square, I glanced back. The stall was dark, the man's figure nowhere to be seen. But I couldn't shake the image of him, standing there so calmly, creeping back into his little stall, as though nothing unusual had just happened. We didn't talk much after that. I think we were all trying to process what we'd just seen. I couldn't sleep for days, and when I closed my eyes, I saw that man's pale face and the way he had disappeared into the shadows. It still gives me chills, even now, years later. As for the stall, it was gone the next time we passed by. The vendor was nowhere to be found, and the stand was empty, just like every other day. But I can't forget what happened. That man was living there, and I don't know how long he had been there, hiding behind a facade, unnoticed by everyone. Sometimes I wonder how many other things we walk past, not realizing they're not as normal as they seem. I was 8 years old when it happened. My family lived in a small, rural house out in the country. The kind of house where the nearest neighbor was a good distance away, but we were never really alone. The nearest neighbor, Mr. Davidson, lived next door, and our properties were separated by a thin line of trees. These trees were thick enough to block most of what was happening on his side of the fence, but thin enough that I could still make out his house and his yard. On the rare occasions I would venture into the backyard, I could see the tall, thin trunks of the trees stretching into the distance, their branches swaying in the wind. There was something strange about living so far out, though. It was quiet, too quiet, and for some reason that always left me feeling uneasy, like there was something just beyond the edge of my sight, something waiting. It didn't help that our house was set back a bit from the road, and the darkness around it always felt oppressive. Mr. Davidson, despite living next door, was an elusive figure. I barely saw him, but I knew when he was home. Every evening, his street lamp would flicker on right at 8 o'clock and shine brightly in his yard. It was the only light on our road. There were no other street lights on our country road, so his light was the only beacon in the dark. It had a timer, so it would shut off around 1 in the morning. That lamp was a strange comfort in a way. It illuminated part of our yard, and my bedroom window faced the yard. Even though the light was distant, it gave me the illusion that there was something out there watching over me. But it also had an unsettling effect on me. As a kid, there was something eerie about it, as though the light was just a little too bright for the vast darkness that surrounded our house. The lamp shone directly into my bedroom, and when the wind blew, the shadows of the trees would dance on my walls, creating shapes that sometimes seemed almost alive. Sometimes they didn't scare me. Sometimes they were just the flickering of branches or the swaying of leaves. But other nights, especially on nights when I was alone in my room, those shadows felt like they were something more. On this particular night, I remember lying in bed, twisting and turning, unable to sleep. My mind was restless. I had tried everything, counting sheep, tossing the covers off, tucking them back in. I was hot, then cold, then hot again. I kept looking at the clock, willing myself to sleep, but it was already past midnight. I rolled onto my back and stared up at the ceiling, hoping the stillness would calm me. But instead of drifting off, I began to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the usual darkness of the room that made me uncomfortable. The shadows on the wall weren't as active as they usually were, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself to sleep, but then I saw it. A face. It wasn't a real face. It was just a shape, a crude face made of light. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by the trees outside. But when I looked out the window, there was no light coming through. The street lamp had been off for over an hour, and the sky was pitch black. The face wasn't moving, and it didn't seem to change, but it felt like it was staring directly at me. It wasn't a detailed face. but it had a strange and unsettling simplicity. It was made of light and dark patches, like something drawn by a child, but its lack of definition made it all the more unnerving. I tried to look away. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but no matter how I turned my head or closed my eyes, the face stayed there, floating above me. The longer I looked at it, the more its features seemed to twist and shift. The eyes felt hollow, and the smile was wide and empty, like it was mocking me. My heart began to race, and my stomach tightened with fear. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The face was there, locked in place, its shadowy contours pressing in on me. The more I stared at it, the more I could feel it pulling at me, as though it was trying to drag me into its hollow eyes. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, like something was choking me from the inside. I looked at the clock again. 2 a.m. That should have been impossible. The streetlight was off by then. I was paralyzed, my body refusing to obey my brain, my chest tightening with every passing second. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I don't know how long I stared at it. Maybe minutes, maybe hours, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, "Mom! Mom!" I had no idea what was happening or why it was happening, but I needed her. I needed to know it wasn't real, that I wasn't losing my mind. She rushed to my room, asking what was wrong. I was still frozen, pointing at the ceiling, tears streaking down my face. I told her not to turn the light on, not to look away from the ceiling. I had to make her see it, the face. But when she looked, she saw nothing. The room was pitch black, just as it should have been. There was no face, no shadow, nothing. She reassured me that it was all just a bad dream or a trick of the light. She told me to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. I was too terrified. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't a dream, that it was real, but she couldn't see it. In the years that followed, the memory of that face lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me, but I never spoke of it again. Not until 6 years later, when I was 14. We had moved out of that house into a different place. My parents had sold the house in the country, and we had left behind the place that had once been home. I was sitting with my mom and my sister one night, talking about old memories when the subject of that house came up. I told them about the face I had seen on the ceiling. I explained how I'd called for my mom, how she hadn't seen anything, and how it had terrified me to this day. I remember my sister dismissing it as a child's imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I decided to draw it. I grabbed a piece of paper and tried to recreate the face I had seen. I remembered its strange, crude features, the empty eyes, the mocking smile. The lines weren't perfect and the shapes weren't clear, but when I finished, I showed it to my mom. Her reaction was instant. She froze. Her face went pale. Her eyes widened as she stared at the drawing. She asked me where I had seen that face before, and I told her it was the one I had seen on the ceiling all those years ago. I watched her hands tremble as she looked at the drawing again, her mouth opening and closing as if she was about to speak but couldn't find the words. Then, she told me something I hadn't expected. She had dreamed about that face. She had seen it in her nightmares almost every week for the entire time we had lived in that house. It had terrified her too, though she never told me about it. She said the face would appear in her dreams, always watching her, always lurking in the dark, just like it had been watching me. It was the same face, the same empty, crude features. My heart sank as I realized that my mom hadn't just been trying to comfort me. She had been trying to convince herself that it wasn't real. That face had haunted us both in different ways for years. It was a strange kind of relief to know that I wasn't the only one who had seen it, that it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me, but was also deeply unsettling. What was that face? Where had it come from? Was it something in the house, in the land itself? I didn't know. I still don't know. But the one thing I do know is that I'll never forget the terror I felt that night, staring at the ceiling, frozen in place, helpless against the dark. And I'll never forget the look on my mom's face when she saw the drawing, because for the first time, I realized that some things are more than just bad dreams. Some things follow you, even when you think you've left them behind. It was my freshman year of high school, and I was still getting used to the grind of marching band, football games, and late nights that seemed to stretch on forever. In Texas, high school football is more than a game. It's a tradition, an event. The stadium was massive for a high school, one of those modern college-sized fields with the shiny AstroTurf, towering floodlights, and that huge, glowing jumbotron that flashed all sorts of cheesy animations between plays. On nights like this, the air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, sweat, and popcorn, the noise of thousands of voices blending into one overwhelming hum of excitement. It was a warm fall night, and I remember thinking how alive everything felt. The lights made the green AstroTurf gleam like it was glowing. The crowd roared as the chaparrals were steadily pulling ahead, the game winding down with only a few minutes left on the clock. The band was playing our fight song, our brass instruments blasting as loud as they could to pump up the crowd. The cheerleaders were in their full uniform, leading the crowd in chants, bouncing and twirling, their pom-poms sparkling under the stadium lights. High school football in Texas was an experience. Even the air felt different when the game was on, like it was charged with this electricity that you couldn't escape, that somehow made the night feel bigger than it was. It's funny, the rhythm of these games, how it all blends together. You have the cheers, the bands, the chants, and then the eerie silence when something goes wrong. When a player gets hit hard, there's always that tense moment when the crowd holds its breath, waiting to see if the guy gets up. If he does, everyone cheers, relieved because it's just a game. It's all part of the ritual. But sometimes things go wrong. I don't know exactly when it happened, but I remember a specific moment when the noise of the game just stopped. There was a tackle, hard enough that the entire stadium seemed to freeze for a second. Everyone could tell it was bad. The boy who went down didn't get up. The whistle blew. The referees huddled for a moment, and the players on the field seemed to sense the shift too. The air became thick, heavy like someone had dropped a weight on all of us. The cheering stopped. The sound of feet on the bleachers stilled. The noise died out slowly, like a song being turned down too quietly. At first, it was just a lull, like when the music at a concert fades between songs. The band stopped playing. The cheerleaders, who were just seconds ago bouncing and shouting, were still now. The entire stadium went silent, like everyone collectively held their breath, waiting for the player to get up. But he didn't. There were murmurs now, ripples of conversation from the stands as people began to sense the gravity of what had happened. You could feel it hanging in the air. That fear, that uncertainty. And then, after a while, it happened. That sound, a woman's cry. It wasn't something that echoed in a flash. It wasn't something that instantly made you think something horrible had just happened. No, it was more like the slow, gut-wrenching wail of someone whose world had just been shattered. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew, echoing through the stadium as if it was coming from everywhere at once. Her grief was so raw, so deep, that it felt like it was coming from the depths of the earth itself. It felt like that sound was stretching out for miles. It was his mother. I don't think anyone really knew what to do. People just stood there, frozen in their seats, as her wailing continued. The sound of her grief was so overwhelming that it swallowed up everything else. I could hear the murmurs in the crowd, people talking softly, wondering if he was going to be okay, if he was just knocked out or maybe had a concussion, but that woman's cry drowned it all out. I don't know how long it went on. Minutes? Maybe more. It felt like an eternity. Tom didn't seem to move normally anymore. The world outside that sound didn't matter. It was as if we were all trapped in this limbo, suspended between the awful reality of what was happening on the field and the helplessness of being unable to do anything about it. Eventually, an ambulance pulled onto the field. The lights from the emergency vehicle cut through the darkness as it rolled toward the center of the stadium. The siren stopped, but the haunting wail of the mother still echoed off the walls of the stadium, bouncing around like it was too big for the place to hold. The paramedics rushed to the boy, who lay motionless on the field, and I watched, feeling a strange sense of helplessness. The football players stood off to the side, watching, their faces solemn. You could see the shock in their eyes, as if they had never expected to witness something like this in a game meant for high school fun. The next few minutes were a blur. I don't remember much of the specifics. only that the boy was carefully placed on a stretcher, his neck supported and stabilized. The ambulance slowly drove off the field, and it felt like the whole stadium collectively exhaled, but not in relief, more in disbelief. No one clapped. No one cheered. There was no joy in this. Everyone knew, even before the officials announced it, that the boy wasn't going to be all right. You could feel it in the air. The gravity of the moment hung there like a heavy mist, thickening with every passing second. I found out later from some of the upperclassmen what had actually happened. The kid had shattered the C4 and C5 vertebrae in his neck. It was a freak injury, something that no one could have predicted. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. He spent the next few years in a wheelchair, and tragically, he passed away at the age of 20. But that moment, that horrible moment when his mother's cries echoed across the stadium, stayed with me. The rest of the game was a blur. The Chaparrals won, but it didn't matter. The crowd didn't cheer. There was no sense of victory. It felt hollow, like a celebration that shouldn't have happened. And the rest of the night, I couldn't shake that woman's wail. It stuck with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear it, echoing in the back of my mind. When I got home that night, I tried to brush it off. I tried to convince myself that it was just a part of the game, that these things happened. But I couldn't. The image of that boy, lying motionless on the field, and the sound of his mother crying out in the dark, stayed with me. It was a part of me now, something I couldn't forget. The innocence of those games, the excitement of the crowd, all of it was suddenly different. It had changed. It took me a long time to shake the feeling. I've gone to other games since, but I couldn't help but think about what could have happened, about how fragile everything is. How something so sudden, something so unexpected, could change lives forever. That sound, that wail is the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. Not because of any supernatural force or haunting. No, it's because of what it represented. It was the sound of real, raw pain. It was the sound of a mother losing everything, of a life shattered in a single moment. And no matter how many football games I've gone to since, no matter how many times I've heard the crowd roar in excitement, that one moment, that one sound will always stick with me. Sometimes I still think about that kid. I wonder what his life might have been like if he hadn't been paralyzed. I think about his family, his friends, and how they must have felt in the days that followed. But most of all, I think about his mother's wail. That sound will never leave me. And it's the kind of thing that, no matter how much time passes, I don't think I'll ever truly forget. It was September 11th, 2001. I was in 4th grade, just a week away from my 9th birthday. I remember waking up that morning with the usual excitement of a kid about to celebrate another year, about to eat cake, open presents, and have a day that felt all about me. Little did I know that the world was about to shift in a way that would stick with me for the rest of my life. I walked into school like any other day, the usual hustle and bustle of children getting ready for class. The day had started off uneventfully, nothing out of the ordinary. My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was as calm as ever, guiding us through our lessons. It was around 9 a.m. when everything started to change. I don't remember the exact moment the phone call came, but I do remember Mrs. Rodriguez standing still, looking down at the receiver with a strange look in her eyes. She took the call, speaking in low tones, and then turned to me. "Emma, you need to go to the office," she said softly, as if there was something in her voice that didn't match the usual routine of school life. I was confused, but didn't question it. It wasn't like I was in trouble or anything. I grabbed my backpack and made my way down the hallway, the sound of my shoes tapping against the floor echoing in the quiet of the school. I wasn't scared, just curious. When I arrived at the office, I noticed my mom immediately. She was sitting there, not her usual calm self. Her face was pale, her eyes red from holding back tears. I looked at her, trying to make sense of why she was here, especially with my 2 brothers in tow, my older brother, who was 15, and my baby brother, who was only 6 months old. My mom was holding him, rocking him back and forth, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me. Her gaze was filled with something I couldn't put into words at the time. It was fear, the kind of fear I had never seen from her before. "Emma," she said, her voice tight and strained. Something terrible happened. I couldn't understand what she meant. The words didn't make sense. Terrible? What was going on? My brain was still so innocent, still wrapped up in the idea that nothing bad could touch me, let alone my family. I hadn't even processed what she said when she turned and walked me out of the office. The halls felt long, like they were stretching in slow motion as we left the building, but I still wasn't scared. Not yet. We got in the car, and I remember being so quiet. The radio was off. Normally, my mom would be telling me about her day or making small talk, but today it was just silence. My brother, in the back seat, was too young to know anything, and my older brother just stared out the window, his face unreadable. It wasn't until we were halfway home that my mom spoke again, her voice still shaking. They attacked the World Trade Center, she said. It's bad, Emma. Really bad. I didn't know what she meant by attack. I had heard of wars, and I knew about things like terrorists from snippets of news here and there. But the weight of those words didn't land on me yet. What did it mean for me, for my family? The silence in the car felt heavier, and I started to feel an unfamiliar tightness in my chest, but I still couldn't grasp the full meaning. We got home, and the news was on. The TV was broadcasting images that I'll never forget. The planes crashing into the towers, the billowing clouds of smoke, people running in the streets, panic in the air. It was too much for my young mind to handle. My mother stood in the living room, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, staring at the screen. My brother was still too little to understand, but my older brother was watching it intently, his face pale. I kept looking back and forth from the TV to my mother, waiting for something, for her to tell me that everything was going to be okay. But she didn't. She looked lost, distant, like she was somewhere far away, even though she was standing right in front of me. Then came the news that my father hadn't answered his phone. My father was a police officer in New York City with over 20 years of service under his belt. He was one of the first responders, and my mom had been trying to get in touch with him all morning. She kept dialing his number, hoping for an answer, but there was nothing, no word from him. The panic in my mother's eyes deepened. She paced around the living room, walking back and forth, glancing at the phone, at the TV, at the clock on the wall. My older brother kept trying to reassure her, but his voice cracked every time he spoke. I just stood there, numb, trying to understand why everything was so wrong. The hours dragged on. My mom kept calling, leaving messages, but there was still no word. She was pale now, no longer looking like my mom. Her face was drawn, her eyes haunted. The silence between us was unbearable. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, my mom's phone rang. The sound was almost deafening in the quiet room. She grabbed it immediately, practically yanking it out of the cradle. "Hello," she said, her voice shaking. I watched her closely. I couldn't make out the words coming from the other end of the line, but I could see her face slowly change. The panic started to ease just a little. Her shoulders relaxed, and she let out a long, shaky breath. I don't think she realized she had been holding it in for hours. "I'm Fine. I'm fine," my father's voice came through the phone. "I'm 2 blocks away. I was supposed to be there, helping with the evacuation, but the guy before me came back late from his shift. He's the reason I'm not in there right now." The building collapsed right as I was arriving. I didn't fully understand the magnitude of what my father was saying, but my mother did. She slowly sat down, her knees buckling as she processed the relief of hearing his voice. It felt like everything in the house paused, like the whole world stopped turning for a moment. My father went on to tell her about how he had been about 2 blocks away when the second tower fell. He had been getting into position, preparing to help evacuate the building, but because of one simple delay, one officer being late, the timing was off, and he wasn't inside when it collapsed. My father never fully came to terms with how close he had come to losing his life that day. He'd talk about it every now and then, but it was never without a visible weight on his chest. He carried the memories of that day like an invisible scar, one that didn't show on the outside but shaped everything he did from that point forward. I didn't realize until much later just how much that moment affected me, too. At the time, I was just relieved, happy that my father was safe, that my family was still intact. I couldn't process the fact that if that officer had come back on time, my father would have been inside the tower when it fell. I couldn't understand what that would have meant for my mother, for me, for my brothers. We might have lost him that day, and everything would have been different. It took me years to fully grasp the significance of what happened. How lucky we were, how fragile everything could be. That one simple twist of fate, that one officer being late, saved my father's life. If he had been on time, he wouldn't have made it out. It was that simple. My father retired a couple of years later. He never talked much about why he chose to leave, but I knew. The emotional toll of that day had weighed heavily on him. He had seen too much, and I think part of him was never the same after that day. The world had changed in ways we couldn't understand, and he had seen the raw, brutal reality of it up close. I still think about that day sometimes, about how close we came to losing everything. And I wonder how many other people out there, in their own way, can trace a path back to that day. How many people were saved by small, seemingly insignificant things like a late officer or a twist of fate? Sometimes, I wish I could go back to that moment, that time before I understood how fragile life was. But I can't, and maybe that's a good thing, because that knowledge, as heavy as it is, keeps me grounded, keeps me aware of how quickly everything can change. September 11th is a day I'll never forget. Not just because of the tragedy that unfolded in front of the world, but because of the personal connection I'll always have to it. The reminder that life is fragile, and that sometimes it's the smallest moments that make the biggest difference. And every year when September 11th comes around, I don't just think about the victims, the families, the heroes. I think about that officer who came back late. I think about how his tardiness saved my father's life. And I think about how lucky I am that I never had to live through the alternative. I had a teddy bear named Spock. I don't remember exactly when I got him, but I'm pretty sure I was around 3 or 4. His ears were pointy, kind of like the ones on a fox or a bat. I didn't care about that though. I loved him. He was always there, no matter what. I remember carrying him everywhere, all the time. It was almost like we were inseparable. Even when I was playing outside, Spock was either in my arms or close by on the grass beside me, patiently waiting. I had other toys, of course, but none of them meant as much to me. I had Spock for so long that it felt like he was part of me. Maybe he was the first real thing in my life that I felt connected to on that deep level. And when I went to bed, Spock was there too, tucked under my arm, his worn-out fur soothing against my skin. I'll never forget the time my older brother took Spock for me. It was a pretty typical day. He was teasing me, as he often did. I remember crying as he punched Spock, slamming the bear into the wall repeatedly, laughing. He was older than me, and I couldn't do anything to stop him. I was sobbing uncontrollably, begging him to stop. I wasn't crying because of the bear getting damaged, though I'd later noticed some small tears in the stitching. I was crying because Spock was my comfort, my protector, and my brother had hurt him. That memory still sticks with me. I can laugh about it now, looking back at how overdramatic I was, but at the time, it felt like the end of the world. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can remember the way my heart dropped, the mix of confusion and helplessness. But that wasn't the worst thing that happened to Spock. That was the start of it, the beginning of something I still can't explain. What happened next, I will never laugh about. It's one of those things you don't forget, even if you try. I was about 8 when it happened. Maybe I was younger, but I think 8 sounds right. I just gone to bed like usual, Spock nestled under my arm, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. I can't remember if I had a dream that night, but I woke up abruptly. The room was dark, and I felt that familiar haze of grogginess that comes with waking up in the middle of the night. It took a few seconds for my brain to catch up with what was going on. I tried to shake off the sleepiness, but as I moved to sit up, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Spock wasn't there. I sat up quickly, my heart racing a little as the fog in my brain started to lift. I reached around, feeling around the bed, hoping I just knocked him off onto the floor or something. But no, he wasn't there. My bed was empty, completely empty except for me. I wasn't the type of kid to get scared easily, but I remember feeling uneasy, a strange kind of sinking feeling in my stomach. I tried to shake it off, convinced that my mom had come in during the night and taken him to wash him. But as I thought about it, It didn't make sense. I never remember my mom taking Spock to the laundry. If she had, I would have heard her. She wouldn't have just come in and taken him without me noticing. I felt a growing sense of panic as I threw the covers off and jumped out of bed. I glanced around the room, scanning every corner, every nook and cranny where Spock might have fallen. He wasn't under the bed or in the closet. Maybe he had fallen off the bed and onto the floor. I searched, turning the room upside down. Nothing. I didn't want to wake my mom up. I didn't want to sound silly, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I needed Spock back. I had to find him. I stepped out of my room, the cool floorboards creaking under my bare feet. The house was quiet, too quiet. It was the middle of the night. Why was it so silent? I turned on the lights as I moved down the hallway, one by one, tried to make sense of things, but there was nothing. My mom's room was empty. I checked my brother's room. Nothing there either. His bed was undisturbed, and there was no sign of anyone being awake. I started to feel a bit unnerved. This wasn't like my mom. She was always there for me. If she was still awake, she would have left the light on, or I would have heard her moving around. Maybe she'd stepped out of the house, but why? Where could she have gone? I felt my stomach twist into knots as I turned toward the stairs and headed downstairs. The old house had a strange way of amplifying sounds at night. The creak of the stairs, the shuffle of my feet. It all felt so loud in the silence. I was half expecting to find my mom and brother downstairs, maybe watching TV or doing something else that would explain why they weren't in their rooms. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs and glanced around, there was nothing. No one was there. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to think, but I knew this wasn't right. I was young, but I had enough sense to know something was wrong. I wasn't home alone. I was sure of that. My mom would never leave me alone in the house. I checked every room, every corner, and I was left with one place I hadn't yet checked. The basement. I froze at the thought. The basement had always terrified me. It was dark, damp, and filled with old things. I never liked going down there, and now I was being pulled toward it, a strange, unavoidable urge pressing me forward. If I wanted to find Spock, I had to check the basement. I knew my mom wouldn't have been down there. It didn't make sense for her to be in the basement, especially at this time of night. But as I stood at the door to the basement, I felt something. A strange pull, a feeling that I couldn't quite explain. It was like I was supposed to go down there. I reached out, slowly turning the doorknob. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack. I opened it further. No sounds, no movement. And then I heard something, a noise coming from the basement, soft at first but growing louder. It sounded like something shifting, scraping against the floor. The hairs on my arm stood up, but I had no choice. I had to find Spock. I crept down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The smell of damp wood and old furniture filled the air. I flicked on a light switch, and the basement lights buzzed to life, flickering once before staying on. I looked around, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. There, behind an old tool kit, was Spock. His lower half was sticking out, just enough for me to see his familiar, pointy ears. It looked like he was waiting for me, almost like he had been placed there deliberately. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt drawn to him. I reached out, and then I froze. A surge of terror hit me like a wave. I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed, the thought of going any closer sending chills down my spine. It was like something was wrong, something about Spock being there. It didn't make sense. Why was he there in the basement of all places? And why was I the only one who knew about it? I turned and ran back upstairs, my heart racing, my breath shallow. I didn't stop to think. I just ran back to my room and dove under the bed, curling up in the dark. I stayed there, trembling, until I heard my mom's voice calling me from downstairs. "Breakfast," she called. It sounded normal. Everything felt normal. I slowly crawled out from under the bed, still feeling the weight of what I had just experienced. Had it been a dream? Was I sleepwalking? I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was just a nightmare. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real. The lights. The basement. Spock. I didn't mention it to my mom right away. I tried to act like nothing was wrong, like everything had returned to normal. But as I sat down for breakfast, my mom and brother asked me something odd. "Why were all the lights on in the house when we woke up?" my brother asked. He looked at me like he thought I was messing around. If it was you, you're in trouble, he joked. But it wasn't a joke. It was serious. I had no memory of turning on all those lights. I didn't even know I had done it. I asked my mom if she had been out of bed during the night, if she'd left the house or anything. She looked at me strangely, as though she hadn't heard a word I said. No, she said, I didn't leave. I don't know what you're talking about. The strangest part came later, after breakfast. I told my mom about Spock. I explained everything, told her about the basement and how I found him there. She listened quietly, her face pale, her expression shifting from concern to confusion. We searched the house again, checked the basement thoroughly, but Spock was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. He vanished, like he had never been there at all. To this day, I don't know what happened. I don't know if I imagined the whole thing, or if it was something else, something I still can't explain. But what I do know is this: Spock was gone, and I never saw him again. The cold seeps into the bones. It's not something you can run from or escape, especially out here in the middle of nowhere with winter holding the land in its unforgiving grip. The forest seems endless, an oppressive sea of white, stretching out in all directions. The wind howls at night, but it's the quiet during the day that gets to you, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I've been alone for weeks now, just me and my thoughts. It started as a simple cabin trip. Nothing special, just a winter retreat to escape the noise, the city, the distractions. I had no intention of coming up here to battle demons or ghosts. I didn't want any of that. But as the days dragged on, something about the isolation began to settle over me. The longer I stayed, the more I could feel my grip on reality slipping, even though I couldn't pinpoint why. The first thing I noticed was the silence. In the forest, there are always sounds. Animals, wind, leaves rustling, snow crunching. Not here, not anymore. It's so quiet now that every noise, every creak of the cabin feels louder than it should be. It's like the world itself has been muffled, sealed off in a cocoon of cold and snow. And then came the hunger. I've always been fine with being alone. I didn't need company to be content. But over time, the hunger for something more started to gnaw at me. Not just food, although that came too, but something deeper. It's hard to explain. Something that just gnaws at the edge of your consciousness. A craving for something you can't name. The first sign I got that something was wrong came when I noticed the shadows moving in my peripheral vision. I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. Shadows cast by the trees outside the cabin, shifting when the branches swayed. But it wasn't just the shadows. It was everything. The way the air felt, thick and still, as if it was waiting for something. And it wasn't just at night. It was all day. Every time I looked at something for too long, I felt the cold press against my skin, but it wasn't the weather. It was something inside me. I started talking to myself, not out loud, but in my mind just to fill the silence. The only voice I could hear was mine, and it wasn't enough. The hunger grew. Days bled into weeks. I was rationing what little food I had left, but it didn't feel like it mattered. It felt like I was wasting away inside, not just physically, but mentally too. I couldn't stop thinking about the forest, about what was out there. The cold made everything feel so distant, so foreign. But there was a feeling, a magnetic pull that made me want to go out there to see what was waiting in the trees. I wasn't sure when the thought first crossed my mind. The idea had always been ridiculous, like a sick joke, but it didn't stop me from considering it. The hunger was becoming unbearable. The way the emptiness gnawed at my stomach and my mind like a slow, insidious burn. I tried to push it away, try to focus on the mundane tasks, chopping wood, checking the traps I set, tending the fire. But it wouldn't go away. It clung to me like a shadow, never leaving. One morning, I woke up to find myself staring at the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of my own thoughts settle in like an anchor. The fire was low. The warmth had dissipated through the cabin overnight. It was too cold. I looked around. Everything looked so far away. There was something missing, something vital, something I didn't want to admit. The hunger was no longer just for food. I went outside, breathing in the biting air, trying to clear my head. The snow crunched beneath my boots. the world seemingly endless in every direction. There was a tightness in my chest, a pressure building with every breath I took. It felt wrong, like my body wasn't responding the way it should. The forest stretched out before me, dark and quiet, its branches swaying in the wind. A part of me wanted to run, to dive deep into the trees, to follow whatever it was that was calling me out there. I didn't know if I could stop myself. That's when I saw it. The movement in the distance. A figure. It wasn't quite human, but not quite anything else either. A shadow, distorted and shifting. For a second, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved again. Slowly, cautiously. My stomach twisted in a knot. I didn't think. I just ran. The cold bit at my face as I pushed myself through the snow, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I wasn't sure what I was running from, but I couldn't stop. It was like I was being pulled toward it. I wasn't even sure if I was running away or toward something. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. When I finally collapsed to my knees, I realized I was at the edge of the forest. I had no idea how I got in here, no memory of the steps it took to get to this point. But I wasn't alone. It wasn't a figure anymore. It was just a shape, kneeling in the snow, its face covered in shadow, but the shape of its body unmistakable. Tall, hunched, too thin, with long, jagged limbs that didn't seem to belong. The snow was stained red beneath it. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. There was nothing in me but the cold and the hunger. It stepped forward, not towards me, but into me. I felt the world shift, the grip of reality loosening. The thing reached out, and without thinking, without even hesitating, I opened my mouth and stepped toward it. It was a reflex, something deeper than thought. The thing in the snow was just another part of me, another shadow that had been hiding all along. In the days that followed, I couldn't remember how much time passed or what happened next. I don't know how long I wandered, but I eventually found my way back to the cabin. The hunger never left me, and I was no longer sure what was real. All I could feel was the cold and the gnawing emptiness inside. The walls of the cabin didn't protect me anymore. I found the remnants of what was left. My family had been here. The hunger had taken them too. I didn't remember it happening, but I knew what I had done. They were gone. All of them. I had consumed them in the silence of the cabin, in the madness of the cold. There was no other explanation. The frost had already begun to creep along the edges of the cabin when I realized what had happened. The thing in the woods hadn't been the Wendigo. It had been me all along. And as I stared at the empty room, I felt the hunger creeping back. It wasn't over. It never would be. The hunger would never stop, and neither would I. It was the summer I turned 15, and I was just like any other kid growing up in my small town in southwestern Oklahoma, surrounded by the deep, dusty air and the endless stretches of open land. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and everyone's business is just another piece of the fabric that holds the place together. I lived in the housing addition where most of the Kiowa people in our town lived, a place that felt familiar, even comforting, at least until that night. My grandma's house was a corner property sitting at the end of the middle street, and it was one of those old, worn-down places with a yard full of memories, some good, some bad. It was one of those hot nights that made you feel like the air itself was thick and the kind of stillness that sits heavily, almost suffocating. It was late, and I was hanging out with a couple of my friends, sitting under the streetlight just outside my grandma's house. The orange light from the lamp cast long, sharp shadows on the cracked sidewalk, and the cicadas were droning away in the trees. We were just talking, laughing at dumb jokes, the kind of evening where you forget about everything else in the world. The streets around my grandma's house were quiet, the kind of quiet that you only get in small towns, where the roads are empty and the houses are scattered far apart. The other two streets in the housing addition were connected by a fence, a standard barbed wire fence that lined the edge of the street, separating us from the farmers' properties on the other side. I had walked along that fence 1,000 times, kicked rocks, and messed around with friends, but that night, something felt different. I don't know what made me look over at the far corner of the street, where the other main street started. Maybe it was just a random glance, but there was something there. At first, I thought it was an animal. It was sitting by the fence, just beyond the streetlight's reach, hidden in the shadows of a couple of big trees with thick, overhanging branches. I could barely make it out, but I could see enough to know it wasn't anything I recognized. I pointed toward it, and the words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. "What is that?" My two friends turned, following my gaze. For a moment, none of us said anything, and all we could do was stare. It was too still, too quiet, almost unnatural. The figure didn't move. It was all black, like a shadow that had somehow taken shape. It was sitting on its hind legs, almost like a dog, but something was off. The way it was positioned, unnatural, stiff. It didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. Then the eyes. They glowed, a soft, almost sickly yellow, piercing through the darkness like tiny headlights in the night. I could feel my skin crawl. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a normal animal. It wasn't something I could identify. I don't know how long we stared at it. Time seemed to stretch, as if the seconds were frozen in place. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, too fast, too loud. It was as if the world had shrunk to just the three of us and that thing, whatever it was, sitting there in the dark. It wasn't making any sound, not even a rustle in the grass. Just stillness. The thing's gaze never wavered. It stared straight at us. I could feel its eyes on me, like it was watching us, studying us. There was no way I could look away. It was too terrifying, too unnatural. I don't know how long it sat there, but it felt like an eternity. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could almost hear my pulse in my ears, beating so loud I thought it might drown everything else out. Then, without warning, it moved. In one smooth, fluid motion, the creature turned its body, and before we could even react, it jumped. It jumped over the fence. No hesitation, no sound. The fence was at least 5 feet high, made of thick wire and old posts, but this thing cleared it effortlessly, landing on the other side without making a single noise. The grass there was tall, and the ground was covered with fallen branches and leaves, but not a single leaf rustled, not a single twig snapped. I felt my stomach twist into a tight knot. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't understand what had just happened. The thing was gone, disappeared into the dark, but I couldn't shake the image of its glowing eyes, staring at us with something like intelligence. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else. Without thinking, we bolted. We ran. No words. Just the sound of our feet pounding on the asphalt as we made our way to my friend's grandma's house at the far end of the street. My family was at a powwow that night, and there was no way I was going to stay alone in my grandma's house after what we had just seen. The whole way there, all I could think about was that thing, what it was, what it wanted, and why it had been staring at us like that. It felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to have seen it. When we got to my friend's grandma's house, we told her what had happened. Her face didn't change, but I could see a glimmer of something in her eyes, something dark. She just nodded slowly, like she already knew what we were talking about. She told us that there were many things in the dark out there, in that part of Oklahoma. Mysterious things. She said that we were lucky it wasn't malignant, that it wasn't something worse. That wasn't comforting, not by a long shot, but I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't want to know. That night, I didn't sleep much. My mind kept replaying the image of that thing, its yellow eyes glowing in the dark, watching us, waiting. I kept telling myself that maybe it was just some weird animal. Maybe it was a coyote or something else, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was something different, something older, something that didn't belong in the world I knew. Over the years, I never really talked about it much. I didn't want to. It was one of those things that you don't ask questions about because you're afraid of what the answers might be. I grew up with stories from my family about strange things, about the land and the spirits that inhabit it, but none of them had ever talked about anything like that. None of them ever spoke about creatures with glowing eyes that watched you from the dark. It's been years since that night, and I still don't know what I saw. I don't think I want to know. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone and I hear the wind rustling through the trees or the sounds of animals moving in the grass, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting, watching. I wonder if anyone else has seen it, if anyone else knows what it is. But I don't ask. I don't want to. The movie was a distraction, something to take my mind off of everything. We didn't have plans to hang out. but we did anyway, as most things go when you're 21 or 22. It was one of those nights where you didn't want to be alone, and for whatever reason, sitting in a theater seemed like a way to kill time. I don't remember what we saw. Honestly, it didn't matter. What I remember most was how it felt coming home afterward. How it felt knowing what was about to happen. I dropped my friend off at his house first. It wasn't far from mine, not even half a mile. I didn't think anything of it. We said goodbye, laughed about something, probably nothing important, and I pulled out of his driveway, heading for mine. I drove the familiar route down the road, not thinking about much. The night air was cool, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness as I turned into the driveway of our house. It's funny how the mind plays tricks. You think you're in control of things. You think you understand what's going on, that everything is going to stay the same. You think you can keep yourself grounded. But that night was one where nothing could stay in its place. I parked in the garage, shutting off the engine, and just sat there for a moment. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, even when you don't realize it yet. My stepbrother's voice broke the silence. He was downstairs in the living room, sitting on the couch, and he told me to call my brother. It wasn't unusual for him to ask things like that. My brother was often out or working, so maybe he just needed a reminder check-in. It was a simple request, but I remember the way he said it. Almost urgent, like he knew something was coming but couldn't quite explain it. I shrugged it off, walking through the house to the landline phone. As I reached for the receiver, a knock came at the door. It was a heavy knock, one that made me pause, thinking maybe I was hearing things. I set the receiver back down, walked toward the door, and opened it. There stood my friend, the one I had just dropped off not even 5 minutes earlier. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and he was holding someone in his arms. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. It was his son, his little boy, not even 3 months old yet. The baby was cradled against his chest, limp, unnaturally still. His skin was a dark shade of blue. His little lips, once pink, now an unnatural color. The boy was completely lifeless. I couldn't breathe. My heart started pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape. My friend's eyes locked onto mine, and in that split second I saw everything. The panic, the fear, the horror. He knew. He knew his son was gone, but he didn't know what to do next. I stood there in the doorway, my mind racing, but I couldn't process anything. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to move, how to help. It felt like time froze. For a moment, everything around me was still. Then the panic set in. I screamed for my parents. I didn't even think to grab the phone. I just ran, pounding down the hallway, banging on their bedroom door, shouting at the top of my lungs for them to wake up. They came running, still groggy from sleep, and when they saw what was happening, they reacted immediately. My dad, being the one who could act without thinking, dashed toward my friend and his son, shouting for my mom to get the medical supplies from the bathroom. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, but my hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I gave him the address, my voice a mess of panic and confusion, my mind spinning. I didn't know how to deal with what I was seeing. The house was filled with frantic energy, everyone moving in and out of the hallway, but none of it made sense. It was chaos, pure and simple. My parents, both experienced nurses, took over immediately. They tried CPR, their faces grim, but even as they worked, they knew what we all feared. My friend was crumbling in front of me, his face lost in a world of disbelief. The baby he had just held, laughed with, loved was gone. I was on the phone with 911 for what felt like hours. The operator asked me questions, but I could barely answer. I kept screaming for help, for them to hurry, but nothing changed. The minutes stretched out longer and longer. I could hear my friend in the background, sobbing, the sound of his grief mixing with my parents' muffled efforts. Then came the sirens. Finally, it felt like too much time had passed. It felt like nothing would ever be right again. The ambulance arrived, but by then, my parents had already worked so hard to revive him. It was pointless, but they didn't stop. They didn't stop until the paramedics took over. I remember how it felt standing in the hallway, completely still, just watching as the world shattered, watching my friend's face fall into a deep, unrecognizable grief. I couldn't look away from the lifeless body of his son, not even when the paramedics arrived, not even when they whisked him away. and it was just me. I drove with them to the hospital. The car felt too small, too quiet, too suffocating. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't say anything. What do you say to someone in that situation? How do you comfort them when nothing can bring their child back? 3 hours at the hospital felt like a lifetime. They tried to save him, but the truth was clear. He was gone. I sat there in silence, holding their hands, trying to provide whatever comfort I could, even though I didn't have words. I didn't have anything to give. When they officially pronounced him dead, the room felt empty, even though it was full of people. The weight of it pressed down on me hard. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Afterward, the police came. They went through their house, taking everything. Diapers, clothes, anything that might have been involved. Evidence. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They were just doing their job. It wasn't until around 9 a.m. that I went home, and I didn't sleep until 11. When I did finally fall asleep, it was with an overwhelming sense of loss. The days afterward felt hollow. My friend's wife, she couldn't even cope with the loss. She dressed their son's teddy bear in his clothes and pushed it around like he was still alive. It was one of the saddest things I've ever seen. She couldn't accept that he was gone. Not yet. It took about a week before I felt normal again, but even then, nothing was the same. The world had changed, and so had I. But more than that, I knew my friend would never be the same. His life had been torn apart, and no amount of time would ever heal that kind of wound. No one could understand it, not unless they'd been through it themselves. I can still remember that night so clearly. The cold silence, the panic, the helplessness. It's a feeling I don't think I'll ever forget. It was the worst night of my life. And as for my friend, well, he never truly recovered. No one ever does, I suppose. I was 17 at the time, working a country club in a wealthy area just outside of the city. It was the kind of place where the lawns were manicured to perfection, and the members, all suited up, were more likely to talk about their yachts than anything else. I didn't belong there. I was just a kid trying to make some extra cash, and to be honest, I fell out of place every time I clocked in. It was a Saturday night when it all started. It had been a long shift cleaning up after some high society dinner event, and by the time I got into my car, I was exhausted. My shift had ended late, maybe close to midnight, and the roads were quiet as I made my way home. The drive wasn't bad, but it was a little sketchy, especially with the route I had to take. I lived on the outskirts of Detroit, in a neighborhood where you were supposed to keep your doors locked and maybe avoid taking certain roads at night. But I didn't think much of it. I was used to it. My car, an old sedan I'd inherited from my dad, had seen better days. The suspension was shot, and the engine rattled a little too much, but it still worked. The streets were quiet as I drove down the long stretch of road, with only a few streetlights flickering here and there. It's the kind of road where, at night, everything feels stretched out and alone. And that's when I first noticed him. There was a car behind me, far enough that I couldn't make out much of it, but close enough to notice its headlights reflecting off my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I was just tired, and it was late. But then I noticed that the car seemed to be staying in the same position, even when the light changed. I turned onto the next street, and I saw that it did the same. I changed lanes, and the car did too. It was a little odd, but I figured it was a coincidence. I turned onto a main road, hoping to put some distance between me and the car. But when I looked back in my rearview mirror, there it was again. The same car, same headlights, staying just behind me, no matter what I did. My heart started a race. The street ahead of me was a long stretch with little traffic, and I began to feel more and more like I was being watched. I could see in the reflection that the car's headlights were still there, but it never seemed to get any closer. It was like it was always staying just far enough behind to be out of view, but close enough to make me uncomfortable. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. I glanced over at the empty streets, the dark houses, and the trees lining the road. It was the kind of night that made every noise seem louder. I tried changing lanes again, hoping that maybe the car would just pass me, but it didn't. It stayed right behind me. The stretch of road ahead was long, and the turns were coming up, and I knew the area well enough to know that once I got closer to home, I'd be on smaller side streets. The car, though, was still right behind me, mirroring my every move. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had no idea what to do. Should I pull over? Should I keep going? I couldn't think straight. My mind raced, and I tried to shake off the sense of panic that was creeping up on me. I turned off on a side street, trying to confuse him. I took a right, then a left, then another right. I did loops around the block. It was the only thing I could think of to do. I didn't want to go home, but I also didn't want to get stuck in the middle of nowhere with a car I couldn't outrun. I wasn't even sure if this guy was following me intentionally, but the longer he stayed behind, the more I felt like something was wrong. The car followed me. I tried a few more loops. Turn, turn, turn. The same car, always behind me, always staying just a little too close. No headlights flashing. No honking. No attempt to pass me. It was like he was just watching. And when I finally got close to home, the car was still there, still following me. I couldn't risk driving straight up to my house. I wasn't sure if he would follow me there, but I wasn't about to find out. So I made a quick turn down another side street and parked. I sat there for a moment, my breath coming out in sharp gasps. My heart was pounding in my chest, and all I could hear was the engine of my car idling. I didn't want to move. I didn't know what to do. I looked out my window and saw his car pull into a spot a few houses down. He parked across the street, just sitting there. My stomach dropped. I didn't know if he was going to get out or if he was just waiting for something. He didn't move. He just sat there, staring at my house. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, but I felt frozen in place. I could see him in the reflection of my rearview mirror. He was still there. I couldn't just sit in my car forever. I slowly got out, not making a sound, and slipped inside the house. I didn't turn on the lights. I couldn't. I stood at the window, peering out through the blinds, trying to make sense of everything. It was like a scene out of a movie, except it was real. The car was still there, and now the guy was standing outside of it, looking around. I woke up my mom, shaking her awake, and she immediately grabbed the phone. "Call the police," I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't hesitate. Within minutes, the dispatcher was on the phone, and my mom was talking fast, telling them what had happened. I felt a sense of relief, but it didn't last long. I still couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I watched as the guy stepped out of his car. He was stumbling a bit, but he wasn't making any effort to leave. He stood there for a while, looking around. It was like he was scanning the street, waiting for something. And then he did something strange. He started walking slowly, a few houses over, then back again, walking in circles. Every time he stopped, he'd stare at a house, completely still, like he was waiting for someone. I couldn't tell if he was watching me or just lost, but it felt like he knew exactly where I was. The police arrived, their car lights flashing as they pulled up to the street. The guy didn't react. They called out to him, and the moment the lights hit him, he froze. They moved toward him, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I could hear their voices, but I couldn't make out the words. All I could do was watch, my heart still pounding, waiting for them to do something. A few minutes later, the cop knocked on the door. My mom opened it, and he stepped inside. He was calm, almost casual, like nothing was wrong. He explained that the guy was a drunk kid who had been at a party and had gotten lost. He had no idea where he was going, but apparently he thought I was heading to the same place. That's why he had followed me, because I was going in the right direction and I was about his age. He hadn't meant any harm, but he had been so out of it that he didn't even realize what he had done. When the police showed up, he had been standing by the sidewalk, peeing in the street. The cop didn't say much more, but I was relieved it wasn't anything worse. It could have been worse. The thought of what might have happened if I hadn't noticed him following me, or if I hadn't turned down those side streets, made my skin crawl. The guy had no intention of doing anything, but in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just off. Something was wrong. That night, I stayed up for hours, lying in bed, my mind replaying every moment of that drive. The thought of someone following me for that long, without making any effort to approach, still made my skin crawl. And even now, years later, when I drive home late at night, I still glance in the rearview mirror just to make sure no one's behind me. As for the sleep paralysis, it didn't stop. In fact, it only got worse over time. The hallucinations, the voices, the figures standing in my room, it all seemed to get more intense. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my chest tight, and find myself staring at the dark corners of my room, waiting for something to move. Sometimes it was a man standing in my doorway. Other times it was the feeling of being touched or held down. But there was one that stuck with me, one that still makes my heart race when I think about it. It happened on a night like any other. I woke up, sweating, barely able to keep my eyes open. There, outside my window, I saw the figure of a man. My car door slammed shut. I saw him there, sitting in my driver's seat, trying to start the engine. My blood ran cold as I watched him through the glass, his face barely visible in the dim light. But when I threw on some pants and ran outside to confront him, the car was empty. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I had been followed all along, even after I thought I had escaped. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in anything unexplainable, really. I prefer things to make sense, clear, tangible reasons for everything. But a few years ago, something happened that left me feeling shaken, and to this day, I still can't fully explain it. It started innocently enough. My partner and I had decided to take a couple of weeks away at her parents' house. They were off on a vacation, and we had the place to ourselves. It was a big, quiet house, nestled on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by thick woods that gave the house a certain isolation. It wasn't a bad place by any means. Her parents were lovely, and the house had a certain charm, old but well-maintained, with rooms that felt warm despite the dark wooden floors and thick, patterned curtains. The first couple of days were uneventful. We spent time in the living room, reading or watching TV, enjoying the space. The days blurred together in peaceful normalcy, and we'd grown used to the creaks of the old house. Sounds that came with age, I suppose. But then, one night, things began to take a turn. I had gotten up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. We'd both been in bed for a couple of hours, the house around us quiet and still. I got out of bed, careful not to wake my partner, and made my way down the hallway toward the bathroom. As I passed through the living room, something odd caught my attention. The cushions on the couch were scattered all over the place, some on the floor, others piled in the corner. It wasn't like that when we went to bed. I knew my partner. She always tidied up before we settled in for the night. It struck me as strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe I had missed something earlier in the evening. I didn't know. I continued down the hallway and into the bathroom. It was just a small space, nothing special. The kind of bathroom that could have been anywhere, really. I sat down on the toilet, taking care of business when I heard it. A knock. It wasn't a soft knock either. It was loud and deliberate, the kind of sound that made the door rattle slightly in its frame. My immediate thought was that it was my partner, but why would she knock? I figured she had maybe forgotten something and was just trying to get my attention. 2 seconds. I called out, half expecting to hear her reply, but nothing. No voice, just the sound of what I can only describe as rasping breaths. They weren't normal breaths. They were deep, rhythmic, like someone struggling to breathe in a way that didn't sound natural. The kind of breath you'd expect from someone out of breath, maybe, but it wasn't the kind of noise you'd hear from my partner. I waited a moment longer, but the breaths didn't stop. They continued, low and almost ragged, as though whoever was outside the door was struggling with something, struggling to even get a breath out. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced. I didn't want to open the door, but at the same time, I felt a strange compulsion to finish what I was doing. The knocking stopped after a while, and the heavy breathing faded. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I finished and stood up. My heart was pounding. I opened the door carefully, expecting to see my partner standing there, maybe holding a glass of water or something. But nothing. The hallway was empty. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. I had probably imagined it, I thought. Maybe it was just the house settling, or perhaps I had heard something from outside. I wasn't sure, but I quickly returned to our room, hoping to get some sleep after the weird moment. When I got back to the room, my partner was awake. "What was that knocking?" she asked, sounding a little alarmed. "I heard it too. Were you okay in there?" I was a little unnerved, but I chalked it up to a weird coincidence. "Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was you knocking for some reason," I said, trying to dismiss it. She didn't seem convinced, but we both tried to go back to sleep. The next day, things only got stranger. We were in the living room, just relaxing, when we heard the loudest noise, a deafening bang, like a gunshot. It shook the room. My first instinct was to look at my partner, who had immediately jumped up from the couch. We both froze for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't just the sound of the bang that startled us. Immediately after the noise, the power went out. Everything went dark in an instant. I could feel the tension between us, both of us knowing that this was no normal occurrence. After fumbling around in the dark, I managed to reset the breaker, bringing the power back on. We both went to investigate the source of the sound. The dining room mirror had come off the wall. It wasn't just leaning against the wall either. It had fallen straight down, smashing into the outlet below. But here's the thing. The wire that had been holding the mirror was still intact. The fixture on the wall was perfectly fine. There was no visible reason for it to fall in such a way. It didn't make sense. We couldn't figure out how the mirror had detached from the wall. It hadn't just slipped off. The wire was still secured, and the fixture was undamaged. But there it was, shattered glass all over the floor and the outlet destroyed. I felt a sense of unease building in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. This was just one of those odd accidents that couldn't be explained. I wasn't one to entertain supernatural ideas. It had to have been something simple. Maybe the wire had worn out over time, or the fixture had loosened. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. That night, things started to escalate. We had already started noticing little things around the house that weren't quite right. Things that could have been dismissed as coincidences or our imagination. But this time it was different. We were in the living room, and we both heard the unmistakable sound of chairs scraping across the floor. Heavy wooden chairs. The kind of sound that could only come from someone moving them with a considerable amount of force. We looked at each other. "Did you hear that?" my partner asked. "Yeah," I replied, standing up. "It's probably just the house settling." I went into the dining room to check, but no one was there. The chairs were in their usual positions, but the sound had been unmistakable. Over the next few days, things continued to happen. The furniture seemed to move on its own. Chairs that we hadn't touched would be pulled out from under the table, and sometimes the sound of someone sitting down would echo through the room when no one else was there. It was as though an invisible person was using the house in ways they shouldn't have been. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I could have sworn I heard muffled voices coming from the other room. At first, I thought it was just the TV, but when I went to check, the room was empty. There was no one there. No sign of anyone having been there recently. Yet the voices had been distinct, almost as if people were whispering. I wasn't sure what was happening, but it was starting to get to me. Even my partner was growing increasingly uneasy. On the final night of our stay, things took a turn that I couldn't ignore. We had both retired to bed, but something was off. The house felt different. The air was heavy, thick, like something was pressing down on it. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, even though there was no one there. It was as if the house itself had become alive in some strange way, like it was watching us. I didn't sleep that night. Every small sound sent my mind into overdrive. Every creak, every shift in the furniture, every breath. I lay there in the dark, my heart racing, until morning finally came. We left the house early the next day. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lingering, something that neither of us could explain. But it wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. I knew that. It was the house itself. Maybe it was old. Maybe it was just us being overly sensitive, but whatever it was, it had a way of creeping into your mind when you least expected it. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house. I don't know why the furniture moved, why the mirror fell, or why we heard things that couldn't be explained. But I'm certain of one thing. It wasn't anything ghostly. It wasn't some supernatural force at work. It was just a house, an old, unsettling house with creaks, cracks, and secrets of its own. We never went back. I moved into my new house about 4 months ago, and it's been a mix of excitement and frustration ever since. It's an old place, a 2-story with a worn-out charm that made it feel cozy at first. But now, there's something unsettling about it. The kind of unsettling that makes you question your own mind and start thinking that maybe you're just imagining things. even when you know you're not. The house has a weird electrical setup. It's not so bad that it's dangerous, but there are quirks that I never expected. The light switches are all over the place. Some are in strange positions, like on the opposite wall of where you'd expect them to be. And then there are switches that do nothing. I'll flick them, thinking they'll turn on a light or something, but nothing ever happens. I've gotten used to it by now. It's just part of the house's oddities, I guess. What started to bug me, though, was the outdoor light right outside my bedroom window. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was one of those porch lights that you assume gets left on because someone forgot to turn it off. It wasn't particularly bright, but enough that it lit up the side of the house. It seemed to turn on at random times in the middle of the night, and it would stay on for hours. And there was no obvious way to turn it off. I told myself it was probably just some weird switch in the house that I hadn't found yet, something buried deep in the strange wiring. But the more I thought about it, the more it bugged me. I started noticing that the light would turn on at the same times, sometimes around 2 o'clock or 3 a.m., sometimes at 4 o'clock. It wasn't every night, but it was frequent enough to make me feel like there was a pattern. At first, I tried to ignore it. I'd pull the curtains closed and forget about it. But it was hard to sleep with the light shining so brightly through the window. After a while, I started getting annoyed, so one night I decided to figure out once and for all. I grabbed a flashlight and started going from room to room, flipping switches, trying to track down the one that controlled the outdoor light. I felt like an idiot at first, moving around the house, flicking switches that didn't do anything. The more I searched, the more I felt like I was losing my mind. There was no pattern to the switches. The house was a maze of light controls that didn't make sense. Some worked, some didn't. Some seemed to control nothing at all. I couldn't figure out if I was missing something obvious or if the house had just been wired by someone who had no idea what they were doing. I spent an hour or more walking through the rooms, flipping switches and checking outlets. I even checked the circuit breaker, thinking maybe a breaker had flipped, but everything was fine. By the time I gave up and went back to bed, the light outside had already turned off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong, something that didn't make sense. It felt like I was overlooking something simple. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the outdoor light flickering on and off played in my head. It was like I was being driven crazy by something I couldn't understand. I told myself I would deal with it in the morning, but I didn't. The next few nights were the same. I'd hear the light click on in the middle of the night, and I'd try to ignore it, but I couldn't. The mystery of it kept gnawing at me. A few weeks later, I finally had a breakthrough. I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to focus on something else, when I happened to look out the window and saw the light come on again. But this time, I didn't just watch it. I grabbed my shoes and went outside. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I understood everything. The motion sensor. It was a motion sensor light. I don't know why it took me so long to figure it out. The light only turned on when something moved right outside my window. I had never thought to look closely enough to see the sensor. It was hidden near the corner of the house, blending in with the shadows. That was it. The mystery was solved. But in some ways, it felt worse now that I knew what it was. Because now I understood the randomness of it. It wasn't just a quirk of the house's wiring or a faulty switch. It was the motion sensor that was detecting things moving near the house in the middle of the night. The strange thing was, I couldn't figure out what was triggering it. I started paying closer attention to the times when the light came on. It wasn't just random anymore. The light seemed to flicker on at certain times, and it wasn't always the same exact time. Sometimes it was late at night, other times just before dawn. But what bothered me the most was that I couldn't figure out what was triggering it. I watched the house from the window a few nights later, hoping to catch whatever was triggering the sensor. And then I saw it. A shadow moved across the porch. It was quick, just a flicker of movement, but it was enough to set the light off. I held my breath, straining my eyes to see what it was, but the shadow vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I felt a tightness in my chest. I didn't know why, but the idea that something was moving around outside my window in the dead of night sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't tell if it was an animal, a person, or something else entirely. My heart raced, and I started wondering if I had made a mistake by coming here. Maybe it wasn't such a good idea to live in a house where I couldn't explain what was happening just outside my window. I tried to talk myself down, telling myself that it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat, something harmless. But then I remembered that I'd been hearing noises outside at night too. Scratching, shuffling, things that didn't feel right. It felt like something was lurking out there, waiting for the light to flicker on so it could slip by unnoticed. The next few days were quiet. I didn't hear any more strange noises or see any more shadows. The light still came on from time to time, but I started to feel a little more comfortable. I had the whole thing figured out. The mystery was gone. But then, last night, something changed. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep when the light outside turned on. It wasn't unusual, but then it stayed on, and stayed on. It was unusual for the light to stay on for that long. Normally, it flickered off within minutes, but this time, it stayed illuminated, casting a bright glow through the curtains. I tried to ignore it, but the light stayed on for what felt like hours. My heart started racing again. Something felt wrong. Something was different. I went to the window and pulled back the curtain just a bit. The porch was empty. Nothing there, but the light stayed on. And then I heard it. A soft scraping noise, like something was dragging across the porch. I held my breath, listening. It was faint at first, but then it got louder, closer. I crept closer to the window, peering through the crack in the curtain. There in the corner of the porch, I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows, just out of sight of the light. It was tall, its form barely visible in the darkness, but I could see enough to know it was not an animal. It was human. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen with fear. The figure stayed there for what felt like an eternity, watching the house, watching the light, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The figure melted into the shadows, disappearing without a sound. I didn't wait any longer. I rushed to lock all the doors and windows, even though I knew it wouldn't do any good. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I had just seen. I had lived in this house for months, convinced that the light and the strange noises were just quirks of the house, something I could explain away. But now I wasn't so sure anymore. The motion sensor light outside my window had always been a mystery, but now it felt like a warning, like it was trying to tell me something I hadn't understood until it was too late. The next morning, I called a security company. I needed cameras. I needed to know who, or what, was out there. I don't think I'll ever feel the same in this house again. The mystery may have been solved, but it's only made me more aware of the things that lurk in the darkness outside my window. I worked at a shoe store for a while, a small, almost quaint place tucked in a strip mall on the edge of town. It wasn't busy, never busy, the kind of store where you'd barely have customers most days, and if you did, they'd wander around for maybe 15 minutes before leaving without buying anything. It was one of those places that seemed destined to fade into obscurity, but it paid the bills, and that was all I needed at the time. The store wasn't much, just a few rows of shoes, a small stockroom, and a couple of chairs for customers to sit on while they tried things on. The overhead lights hummed softly. The faint murmur of the heating system was almost constant, and the air always smelled faintly of leather and cleaning supplies. All in all, it was a pretty normal job, nothing extraordinary about it, and I liked it that way. I had the closing shift most nights, which meant I was alone when the last customer left and the store doors locked behind me. It was peaceful in a way. The buzz of the overhead lights was comforting, almost familiar. The whole place felt empty but safe. The Muzak system was my only company while I cleaned up, putting away stock, and prepping for the next day. It wasn't bad music. Mostly corporate-approved pop, instrumental stuff, a few easy listening tracks. I wasn't a fan, but it wasn't horrible either. I got used to it. One night, around the middle of my shift, something strange happened. I had just finished putting a new shipment of shoes away and was walking back to the front of the store to check on the display when the music got quiet. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was almost like someone had suddenly turned the volume down to a whisper. I stopped what I was doing and looked up at the speakers, my mind already buzzing with thoughts of technical problems. Maybe the system was malfunctioning again. The store was old and the equipment never worked quite right. I leaned over the counter and reached for the control panel behind the register, my fingers brushing the plastic surface. Before I could touch it, the music changed. At first, it was subtle. The sound of the music was still faint, but it wasn't the usual easy listening track. Instead, a new song started, and it was strange, old sounding like something from another time. The best way I could describe it was like hearing a record being played on a phonograph. Scratchy, imperfect, and distant. There was a man's voice, deep and hushed, so low that it was hard to understand at first. He was singing in this bluesy, almost mournful tone. The words were indistinct, just a low, rumbling hum underneath the crackling of the record. I leaned in closer, trying to make out the words. I could barely hear them, but there were certain ones that stood out almost too clearly. God, Satan, evil, kill. The words echoed in my mind, growing louder with every passing second. I was frozen. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the feeling that they gave me, this creeping unease that slithered up my spine. The voice wasn't loud, but it felt like it was inside my head, twisting around my thoughts, mixing with the soft hum of the lights above me. It lasted maybe 20 seconds that felt like hours, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the song returned to its normal volume. The easy listening track resumed, as if nothing had happened. I didn't know what to think at first. I stood there for a moment, staring at the speaker, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. I didn't believe in anything supernatural, so I wasn't about to assume anything weird was going on. But what the hell was that? A prank? Some malfunction with the CD player? I didn't know, but it felt wrong. I went about the rest of my shift, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The quiet after the incident felt even quieter than usual. The normal hum of the store, somehow, more suffocating. I kept looking at the speaker, half expecting it to happen again, but it didn't. The next night, the same thing happened. I was once again alone, the store eerily empty, the music playing softly in the background as I tidied up. I had just finished vacuuming the carpet near the display racks when the same quietness fell over the room. I froze, expecting the same strange, old song to start playing, and it did. This time, it was even more distorted, more scratchy, like someone had taken a record and played it with their fingers. The voice came again, low and almost inaudible, the words jagged and uneven. Again, God, Satan, evil, and kill. It was the same exact pattern as the night before. My stomach churned, and I couldn't move for a moment. This wasn't a coincidence. Something was wrong. I didn't tell anyone about it that night. Who would believe me? It sounded insane, even in my own ears. I couldn't explain it, so I didn't try. But it kept happening. Not every night, but often enough. The same low, bluesy song would start in the middle of whatever CD was playing, each time with the same muffled voice whispering those same unsettling words. And it wasn't like it happened during a particular song or at any specific time. It was random, unpredictable. One night, I decided to try and figure out what was going on. I checked the CD player, sure that there had to be some malfunction with the track. Maybe it was a problem with the old system, something getting stuck, some glitch. But when I checked, the CD was fine. No scratches, no skips. The same tracks were in place as always. And the system wasn't showing any error messages. There was no technical explanation for it. I even checked the wiring behind the counter, convinced that maybe there was something wrong with the connections. But nothing was out of place. Everything was normal, except for the music. It was driving me crazy. And it wasn't just me. One of the other girls who worked there, Sarah, mentioned hearing the same thing. We were both on closing shifts, so we'd be alone when it happened. She told me that it happened to her a few times too, always when she was by herself. The same low voice, the same words, always the same. She didn't know what it was either. I tried to brush it off, but each time it happened, it felt harder to ignore. It wasn't something I could just laugh off or rationalize. The fact that it didn't happen every night made it worse. Made it feel like some kind of deliberate puzzle that I couldn't solve. The randomness of it, the way it just appeared out of nowhere, made it all the more unsettling. But then, a few months later, it stopped. Just like that. The strange, low voice never came back. The Muzak played as it always had before, quiet and predictable. For a while, I thought maybe it was just over, that whatever had been causing it had worked itself out. But I couldn't forget it. I kept thinking about it, wondering what the hell it was. And to this day, I still don't have an answer. I don't know if it was some kind of malfunction, some weird glitch in the system, or was something else entirely. But the words that played, the music that warped and twisted itself into that eerie, distorted record, still linger in my mind. I never did find out who or what was behind it. And maybe that's the scariest part, not knowing. I don't work there anymore, but sometimes when I hear a song on the radio that sounds a little too familiar, when I hear a voice that's a little too low, a little too distorted, I can't help but remember. I never want to find out what was behind it, but part of me wonders if I'll ever really know. But I'm okay with that, because some things are better left unanswered. I was 18, and even though I wouldn't have admitted it back then, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. It's strange how you can walk around thinking you're grown, acting like you've got the world figured out, when really, you're just a kid with a license and enough gas money to get lost. That's how I ended up on the wrong side of town that day, back in the late summer heat, driving around in a beat-up old Corolla that rattled when I hit bumps and smelled faintly of mildew no matter how many pine-scented air fresheners I hung from the mirror. I had been trying to get to a friend's new apartment. She had just moved for college and sent me directions that made sense in her head, but not in mine. This was before GPS was in everyone's pocket. I had scribbled the directions on the back of a receipt and taped it to my dash, but I had made a wrong turn somewhere, probably 2 or 3 wrong turns, and I ended up in a part of town I didn't recognize. It didn't look like the kind of place I should be driving through alone. The buildings were run down and covered in graffiti, broken windows, trash in the streets, people standing on corners who watched my car as it crept past, too slow because I was trying to read street signs while keeping my doors locked. My hands were slick on the wheel, and I remember thinking my car suddenly felt very small. I spotted a Circle K at the next intersection. It looked rough, windows smeared with grime, one of the neon letters flickering, the whole thing slouched like it was trying to fold into itself. But I needed help. I needed someone to tell me where I was and how to get the hell back to familiar roads. I pulled into the lot and parked near the front, leaving my engine running. There were a few guys standing around outside. One was smoking. One leaned against the wall, staring at the pavement. Another was pacing slow circles, like he was bored or waiting for something. I didn't know which one to ask. I felt like every I was on me the moment I stepped out of the car. My heart was hammering, but I told myself not to be dramatic. People live here, I thought. This is just a neighborhood. Stop acting like it's a war zone. I rolled my window halfway down and called out to the nearest guy. He looked over and walked up to the car like he'd been waiting for me to ask. He was probably in his early 20s, thin, with sharp cheekbones and a hoodie despite the heat. I told him the street I was trying to find. He nodded and said he knew where that was, said he was heading in that direction and could show me the way. He said it like it was no big deal. I hesitated for a second, but he already had his hand on the passenger door handle. And me, being the dumbass 18-year-old that I was, I unlocked the door. He got in and told me where to turn. His directions came quickly, confidently. We left the Circle K and drove through more streets I didn't know. Every block we passed looked rougher than the last. I was sweating, trying to stay focused on the road, heart thudding. He leaned back in the seat. Watching the street signs like this was just another day. 3 miles in, he shifted in his seat. I saw him look at me. I could feel his eyes on me even before he spoke. You know, he said, by now I could have raped and killed you. That's what he said, just like that. My stomach dropped. I kept driving because I didn't know what else to do. My ears were ringing. He wasn't looking at me like he meant to scare me. He said it like he was telling me the weather. He went on, said it happened to his sister 2 years ago. Some guy offered her a ride. She said yes, and she didn't come home. They found her days later. It changed him, he said. Said he sees girls like me, trusting strangers, and it makes him feel sick. He said I seem like a nice girl, and he'd hate to hear something bad happen to me. Then he told me I could let him out at the next light. I pulled over without saying anything, my knuckles white on the wheel. He got out and walked away like nothing happened. I sat there shaking for a while. I don't remember how long. I don't remember how I got back to familiar streets, either. Eventually, I made it to my friend's place, but I didn't tell her what had happened. I didn't want to say it out loud. I didn't want to hear myself admit how stupid I'd been. You'd think that would have taught me something right away, but it didn't. Not long after, I started a job in door-to-door sales. Some company had put a flyer on my car window at a gas station, and I called them because I needed cash and they promised fast money. It was one of those summer scams, but I didn't know that then. They gave me a little laminated badge and a clipboard, and I went walking around unfamiliar neighborhoods with a fake smile and a sales pitch memorized like a script. It was my first day, and I had been knocking on doors for hours. Most people ignored me. A few slammed the door in my face. Some gave me weird looks, but listened long enough to say no. And then one guy invited me in. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, tall, with thinning gray hair and heavy-lidded eyes. He answered the door in a tank top and jeans. When I gave him my pitch, he said he wanted to support young people trying to work and that he'd grab his checkbook from the kitchen. Told me to come inside while he got it. I did. I followed him in like a fool. The door closed behind me with a quiet click that suddenly felt deafening. The house was dark, blinds drawn. The air smelled like dust and old meat. I stood near the front, uncomfortable. I looked at the walls, cluttered with old pictures and plaques. I could hear him in the kitchen, drawers opening and closing. When he came back, he didn't have a checkbook. He had a soda in one hand and nothing in the other. He leaned against the wall and looked at me, then said almost the exact same thing the guy from the car had said. He told me I shouldn't be going into strangers' homes, that he could have done anything to me and no one would know where I was. Said I looked young and naive, and that it made him angry to think about what could happen to someone like me. Then he opened the door and told me to leave. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch me, but I remember his eyes more than anything. He wasn't being creepy. He was being honest. It was almost like he was disappointed, not in me, but in the world. I walked out and didn't knock on another door that day. I didn't go back to the job. That was years ago. I'm older now, and I think about those two men more than I want to admit. I think about how it could have gone differently both times. I think about how incredibly lucky I was that the people I trusted stupidly were the kind of people who didn't take advantage of it. They could have. They didn't. They could have ruined my life or ended it. Instead, they gave me warnings. Maybe they were telling the truth about their pasts. Maybe they weren't. I'll never know for sure. But what they said stuck. They could have scared me into silence, but instead, they scared me into caution. I tell myself I've learned. I lock my doors now. I don't stop in sketchy places, and I don't let strangers into my space, no matter how polite they seem. I carry pepper spray. I keep my phone charged. I send my location to friends. I know better now, but sometimes when I'm alone late at night, I think about how I was just a few minutes away from being one of those missing girls on the news. And no one would have known where I went or who I was with. I think about how easy it would have been. I don't believe in fate, but I do believe that people like those two men, flawed, strange, maybe even broken in their own ways, try to teach me something the hard way because they knew the cost of not knowing. And I listened. That's why I'm still here. It's hard to explain these things to people. Some roll their eyes, others smile and nod, and then tell you a story about a haunted house they once saw on a ghost tour or a dream they had that came true once when they were 12. What I'm talking about isn't like that. It's not horror movie material. It's not flashy. It doesn't announce itself with whispers in the dark or shadowy figures at the end of hallways. It just happens quietly. It passes through us like a breeze you barely notice, but that somehow moves everything around. It's been this way for as long as I can remember. Not everyone in the family has it. There are 6 kids on my dad's side, him and his siblings, and it's only touched some of them. My dad has it. I do too. My grandma, his mother, definitely does. My uncle, her youngest, has it. One of his kids shows signs of it now and then. It's like a current, something that hums beneath the surface. It doesn't come often, maybe once every couple of months if that. But when it does, it's sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. I don't talk about it much. None of us really do, except with each other. It's not a secret so much as something we just don't see the point in explaining. If someone understands, they already understand. If they don't, there's no use in trying to convince them. There are too many stories to tell, and some of them don't even make sense out loud. I've learned not to try to force the connections, but 2 of them stick with me. One of them happened a couple of years ago. It started out like any normal day, which is how most of these things seem to start. My dad was getting ready for work. I remember it was a Thursday because I was dreading something stupid at school. A presentation, I think. I was still in bed when he got up, showered, got dressed. He didn't mention anything to anyone that morning, but later he told me the flashes had started when he was in the shower. Not visions exactly, more like vivid thoughts. A man in full military uniform, just standing there, not doing anything, not saying anything, just present. The image kept coming back to him throughout the day. When he was shaving, when he was brushing his teeth, when he was picking out his work shirt. A man in uniform, sometimes facing him, sometimes walking away. No real context. My dad's not the kind of guy who jumps to conclusions. He pushed the images away, chalked them up to nothing, and went about his day. But then came the sensation. It started as a dull pressure in his right thigh, like he was sitting on something, that feeling you get when your wallet is in your back pocket and you've been sitting on it too long. Not painful, not sharp, just there. He said he kept adjusting how he sat, even took the wallet out at one point and rubbed the spot, but it didn't help. The feeling stayed with him all day. Meanwhile, I was at home. It was a slow morning. I'd slept in, made some toast, stared at the wall longer than necessary. And then I started to feel something too. Not pain exactly, but this pressure just above my heart, like a thumb pressing lightly but firmly on my chest. Not enough to hurt, just enough to make me aware of it. I pressed my hand to my chest a few times. I moved around, changed shirts, drank water. Nothing made a difference. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was stress or maybe a muscle thing. But as the day went on, the feeling stayed. It didn't grow or lessen. It just stayed. That evening, my dad and I crossed paths in the kitchen. We both looked tired, distracted. I asked him if anything weird had happened that day. I told him about the pressure in my chest. And when I said that, something in his face changed. Not fear exactly, but awareness. He looked at me for a long time, then asked me to sit down. That's when he told me about the man in the uniform and the pressure in his leg. We sat there, saying nothing for a long time. Then he stood up and got the phone. He called my grandma. She answered, and he put the phone on speaker. He didn't say hello, or how was your day, or any of that. He just asked her straight if she had touched or looked at anything of her father's that day. Her father, my great-grandfather, had died when she was still young. She didn't talk about him much, not because there was anything dark or shameful, just because it hurt. She'd lost both her parents too young, and the grief had never really let go of her. There was silence on the other end of the line, long silence, and then she said yes. That morning, she'd been going through an old trunk she kept in her closet. She hadn't touched it in years, but something had pulled her to it. Inside, she'd found his wallet, his medals, his photo in full Air Force uniform. She held each of them, looked at them, then carefully put them back. We didn't say much more that night. We all felt the weight of it, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of quiet that settles into a room after something significant happens. We talked more about it later, in person. My grandma, normally guarded, opened up a little about her father, about how proud he was of his service, about how he died suddenly, and how that loss had changed her. It made sense in some way that something passed through all of us that day, not in a mystical way, not as ghosts or spirits, just as connections, strong ones. That experience didn't scare me. It wasn't meant to, but it reminded me of something else, something older, something I didn't experience myself, but that I grew up hearing about. When my dad was a kid, he shared a room in the basement with my uncle. There were too many kids and not enough bedrooms. So the basement became part of the house in a way most basements don't. Their room was near the TV room when my grandparents would sit at night watching old programs. The house was quiet most of the time and things had a rhythm. But one night, everything went sideways. My dad woke up screaming. Not the kind of screaming that comes from a bad dream, but the kind that comes from something deeper. He was crying too, sobbing. My grandparents ran in. My grandma wrapped her arms around him. My grandfather tried to soothe him, but he wouldn't stop. He kept repeating something over and over again, that they'd all died, that it had happened on a mountain, that someone needed to help them. Eventually, He calmed down enough to breathe normally, and my grandma stayed with him until morning. He couldn't sleep the rest of the night. The images, whatever he'd seen or felt, stayed with him. The next morning, my grandma opened the newspaper. On the front page was the story of a train crash in the mountains of South America. No survivors. Dozens dead. It had happened overnight while my dad slept, while he dreamed. That wasn't the last time something like that happened. It wasn't the first either. These things thread through our lives like vines. They don't come with explanations or instructions. They just are. Some people dream things before they happen. Some people feel things as they're happening, even from far away. Some people just get quiet, uneasy, like animals before a storm. I don't always know what to make of it. I've had flashes. Once I couldn't stop seeing a sink overflowing, water spilling out, soaking the floor, running down into a dark basement. 2 days later, I got a call from cousin in another state. Her water heater had burst in the night. Her basement was ruined. I hadn't thought to tell anyone about the image when I had it. What I've said, hey, I keep seeing a wet floor in my head. Sometimes I try to write these things down, not because I need proof, but because I don't want to forget. They come and go like dreams, and if I don't anchor them, they float away. My dad does the same thing, though he doesn't call it that. He just jots things in the margins of his calendar. Words like pressure, or uniform, or falling. Later, he connects the dots. Not every feeling or flash means something. We're not oracles. We don't walk around predicting the future. Most days are quiet, but then something stirs. A pressure behind the ribs. A sharp thought that appears fully formed. A face we've never seen, but feel like we know. What makes it hard is the silence. There's no voice to it, no message. Just feeling, just knowing. It's like trying to tune a radio to a station that's only broadcasting once a month for 10 seconds at a time. You have to be listening, always, or you'll miss it. And if you do catch it, good luck explaining it to anyone else. I used to think there would be some grand explanation. That someday I'd find a book or meet a person who could lay it all out for me. But now I know that's not how it works. It's not about answers. It's about attention, about respect. When something moves through me, I don't push it away. I sit with it. I notice it. I don't try to turn it into more than it is. And I don't pretend it's nothing. The more I've accepted it, the more grounded it feels. It's not magic. It's not fantasy. It's a part of being alive, I think. A deep part, like how animals sense earthquakes or birds change direction before a storm. We're not so different. We just forget. I haven't had a feeling in a few months now. Things have been calm, but I know it'll come again. A pressure behind my heart. A face in my mind. A thought I didn't think myself. When it does, I'll be ready. I'll pay attention, because in our family, these things don't knock loudly. They whisper, and they only whisper to some of us. When I was about 10 or 11, my family lived in a modest one-story house tucked away in a quiet area of California. It wasn't a small house, but wasn't fancy either. Just a solid, weathered home that sat on about an acre of property. The kind of place where you had enough room to breathe, but still had neighbors within earshot if you yelled loud enough. We had a big backyard, a detached garage my dad worked in almost every night, and a side yard where we kept our motorhome parked under a metal cover, the kind with a curved roof and open sides that let the wind blow right through. The cover was old and rusted in spots, but it held up just fine. My room faced that side yard. The window above my bed looked directly out toward the motorhome and the structure that covered it. I used to press my face up against the glass sometimes and just stare out there. During the day, it was nothing special. Patchy grass, the motorhome, and the trees on the property line. At night it got dark out there, darker than most kids would be comfortable with. No streetlights reached that side of the house. When the moon wasn't out, it was just pitch black, broken up only by whatever light came from our windows or the garage if my dad had it open. I remember the inside of my room really clearly. It wasn't very big, just enough space for a bed against one wall, a dresser under the window, a small desk with a chair in the corner, and a closet that barely fit anything. The carpet was beige, but stained in a few places from who knows what. I had a poster of a dirt bike on the wall that I thought made me look cool, and an old lava lamp on the dresser that barely worked anymore. My sheets were plain blue. The the kind that pilled after a few washes, and I had a cheap little digital alarm clock with glowing red numbers that I checked way too often at night when I couldn't sleep. That night was like any other night. My mom had told me to get ready for bed around 7:30, and I did what I always did, brush my teeth, use the bathroom, and climbed into bed a few minutes before 8. I could still hear the TV from the living room even though my door was closed, and I could faintly smell whatever air freshener my mom liked to spray around the house. I laid there staring at the ceiling like I usually did. I had a habit of counting how many seconds it took for my body to start feeling heavy, like I was sinking into the bed. It was dumb, but it helped me relax. The window was slightly cracked open to let in some air. It was a warm night, warmer than usual, and the room had that stale, stuffy feeling it got in the summer. I could hear the sound of crickets outside, loud and steady, like a soft buzz that wrapped around the house. Every now and then, I'd hear a car pass by on the road out front, but mostly it was quiet. I figured my dad was probably in the detached garage behind the house, working on something like he always did. He'd come home from work, eat dinner, and then head out there almost every night with a beer in one hand and a toolbox in the other. I liked that about him. He always had some project going on, fixing an old lawn mower, welding something, tuning up his old truck. The guy couldn't sit still if you paid him. I remember that feeling when something changes in a room and your body senses it before your brain does. That's what happened. I was just lying there, barely tired, when I noticed my room start to brighten. Not suddenly, not like someone flicked on a switch, but gradually, like a sunrise, except it was the wrong color. The light that filled the room wasn't white or yellow like a lamp. It was a pale yellow, almost sickly, with a kind of dull warmth to it. Not hot, but thick, like the air had turned into syrup. It came from the window. It didn't flicker or move. It just poured in. I sat up in bed slowly, confused. The light wasn't coming from the direction of the garage. It was coming from the side yard, the spot where the motorhome was parked. I climbed out of bed and stepped over to the window, careful not to make any noise. I rested my hands on the sill and leaned forward to look out. But the motorhome wasn't there. At least, I couldn't see it. The spot where it should have been, between the support beams of the metal cover, was just flooded with that pale yellow light. It wasn't like someone had shined a flashlight into my room. It was like the light was in my room. Every corner, every shadow, every detail was visible. I could see the seams in the drywall, the scratches on my dresser, the dust floating in the air. It was brighter than any light I'd ever seen, but it didn't hurt my eyes. It was just complete, like the world outside didn't exist anymore. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe a few seconds, maybe a few minutes. Time didn't feel right. My hand started to feel cold from resting on the windowsill, but the rest of me was warm. I couldn't look away. The side yard was glowing, but I couldn't see the source of the light. It didn't come from a beam or a spotlight. It just existed, like the air itself had turned into light. And then I saw it. A figure stepped into view, not from behind anything, just into the light. It was tall, but not too tall. Maybe the height of an adult man. But its proportions were off. It was too thin. The limbs were long and narrow, almost bony, like someone had stretched them out. Its head was the worst part, too big for its body, shaped like an upside-down teardrop, smooth and bald. I couldn't make out any features on its face. It was like the details were blurred out or hidden behind the brightness. It stood there in the light, motionless, facing me. I didn't feel scared at first, just numb. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, but something about it kept me from panicking. I didn't even back away from the window. I just stared, my hands gripping the sill hard enough to make my knuckles ache. It was as if I wasn't supposed to move. Then it raised one of its long arms and slowly lifted a hand. The fingers were thin and looked too long, like they'd been stretched. It opened the hand, palm facing me, and waved. It was a slow wave, just one smooth motion like it was acknowledging me. Then the figure stopped moving, the light pulsed once, and everything vanished. Just like that, the light, the figure, gone. I was standing in darkness again, blinking hard. My room felt cold now, like the air had dropped 10 degrees. The glow from my alarm clock looked dim, almost useless. I backed away from the window, sat down on the bed, and just stared at the wall. My brain tried to process what had just happened, but it couldn't find anything to compare it to. I had no reference point. I hadn't felt afraid while it was happening. Only afterward did the panic start to crawl in. I felt sick to my stomach, and my skin tingled like I'd been sunburned. I got up, opened my bedroom door quietly, and padded down the hallway. The living room light was on, and the sound of the TV was still going. My dad was there in his recliner, like always, a can in his hand, staring at the screen with the volume too low to really hear. He didn't look up at first, and I just stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. I waited until he finally noticed me. I remember thinking that his face looked normal, calm, unchanged, like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't just turned upside down. I turned around and walked back to my room. The hallway felt longer than it ever had. I climbed back into bed and stared at the ceiling again, but this time I didn't count the seconds. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning was a Saturday. I got dressed and went outside right after breakfast. I didn't say anything to anyone. I walked around the house, went to the side yard, and stood next to the motorhome. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. No scorch marks, no footprints, no damage. The grass was still patchy, the dirt dry and cracked. I walked around the motorhome twice. I looked up into the rafters of the metal cover. I even walked all the way to the back of the property line to make sure nothing had been moved or disturbed. There was nothing, no sign of anything. It was like it had never happened. I tried to explain it away. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe I had fallen asleep with my eyes open and imagined the whole thing. But I remembered everything. Every detail. The light. The figure. The wave. Years went by. We moved out of that house when I was 14. My dad's job changed and we ended up downsizing. That property was sold to a couple with kids and a dog, and I never went back. Now I'm an adult. I've lived in apartments, townhouses, and shared places with roommates. I've worked jobs that kept me up late, and I've walked down some strange streets at night. But nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever come close to that one night. I've told myself it was a dream more times than I can count. But every time I close my eyes and remember that moment, the warmth of the light, the stillness in the air, the way my room looked lit up like a hospital, I know it wasn't. I didn't imagine it. I didn't dream it. It happened. And the truth is, I don't care about what it was anymore. I don't care about explanations or proof or theories. I just want to understand why it happened to me. Why it picked that house that night, that moment. Why it stood there in the light and waved. And why it never came back. I grew up in a small village near the Czech border. It wasn't one of those postcard places with neat rows of flower beds and colorful roofs. It was just quiet, spread out, and mostly made of old farmhouses, a few barns, and people who had lived there forever. 60 people, give or take. Everyone knew everyone. I could have told you who lived in which house, how old they were, what kind of car they drove, even what they usually ate for dinner. That was just life out there. Slow, simple, cold. In the winter, our house was near the southern edge of the village, maybe the third to last before the forest started taking over. If you stood in our front yard and looked north past the pond, you could see a hill across from it, and on top of that hill was a crumbling old house. The roof was broken in parts. The paint on the wooden siding had peeled away long ago. Big trees stood in front of it, branches like arms stretched wide. No one had lived there for decades. No one talked about it either. It was just there, part of the background. The winter when I was 10 came in hard and early. Snow started falling in late October, and by mid-November we had thick piles covering the ground, maybe 20 centimeters deep in some places. My friend Anya and I were still small enough to think winter was magic. We didn't care about the cold, as long as we had our gloves and boots and each other. Our parents let us play outside after school until it was dark. That meant maybe 4:30 in the afternoon on those short days, sometimes later if the street lamps were on. There was one particular evening that I still think about, even now, years later. We were out playing near the edge of the pond, throwing snowballs at each other and sliding around on the icy patches. The lamps along the main road were casting this yellow light over everything, making the snow glow soft orange in places. We'd been out for a while, not paying attention to anything except our game, when I noticed something strange. I turned toward the pond to scoop up more snow when I happened to glance across it, toward the hill with the old house. I saw a light. It wasn't bright. It was small, low to the ground, about knee height. A soft glow, orange like the street lamps, but somehow warmer, almost flickering like a flame. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't fixed either. There was something human about it, like it was being held. It reminded me of those old oil lanterns my grandfather used to keep in the cellar with the flame behind the glass. I stood still for a long time, staring at it. It was too far away to make out any shapes. Just the light. It looked like it was coming from the ground, or just above it, like someone was squatting by the tree. I didn't want to think that, but that's what it looked like. Someone crouched down in the snow, just holding a lantern. I felt cold in a different way. Not the usual kind. Not the kind that made your hands hurt or your nose run. It was a slow, creeping cold inside my chest, under my jacket, and my throat. I stared for a while. The light didn't move. I blinked a few times, wiped my eyes with my glove. It was still there. Eventually we left. I don't even remember if we said anything to each other then. I don't remember the rest of the walk home. But I do remember lying in bed that night, trying to convince myself it was a reflection or a trick of the streetlights, something normal, something explainable. I didn't really believe it. The next day we talked about it. I remember it now like a photograph in my mind. Her face pale in the morning sun, her voice unsure. We both saw the same thing. The light, the height, the shape. That was enough to keep me awake that next night too. I tried to tell my parents about it. They just laughed. They told me it was a reflection from the pond, or maybe light bouncing off a window of the old house. But I knew the windows were higher. That house had been empty for so long that even the front steps had collapsed. The bottom window sills were at least a meter off the ground. This light was far lower. Too low. Even though I was scared, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So the day after, Anya and I decided to go check it out. It was a Saturday. We told our parents we were going sledding near the north pasture, which wasn't a complete lie. We just kept walking a little further than we were supposed to, past the pond, across the wooden bridge that led to the base of the hill, and then up through the snowy pasture. The snow was thick, but not untouched. We found the tracks almost immediately. They came from the direction of the woods, not from the walking path or the village road, but from the tree line behind the house. Long, deliberate footprints in the snow, spaced like an adult stride. Not a dog, not a deer. These were human footprints, and they led straight to the tree where we'd seen the light. The snow under that tree was packed down, not just by footsteps, but by someone sitting there or crouching. The area was wide and disturbed. No fresh snow had covered it yet. That meant whatever happened, it was recent, maybe even late the night before. The trail continued past the tree between the house and the barn. The space there was tight, maybe a meter wide. The snow was deeper there, untouched except for the continuation of those same footprints. As we followed them, we noticed something else. Just below the surface of the snow, the ground was uneven, brittle. Bits of broken tile and slate poked through in places. We kicked at the snow with our boots and saw that under it were large shards of roof tile, old, splintered sharp, the kind they used on barns 50 years ago. We didn't go any further. The space behind the house was darker, the trees hanging close, and it felt wrong. I still don't know how to describe it. Just that strange kind of wrong that makes your body want to leave before your brain understands why. After that, we didn't go back up the hill again. Not even during the day. But we kept seeing the light. Almost every evening, sometime after sunset, it would appear in the same place, low to the ground near the tree. Some days it would flicker for only a few minutes. Other times it would stay for almost an hour. It never moved, never shifted, but it was always there. We never saw anyone approach it, never saw anyone leave. There were no lights on in the house, no other signs of life. We started walking different paths through the village to avoid having to pass the pond. I started closing my curtains at night, but it didn't stop me from checking. I'd peek out from the edge of the window just to see if it was there. It usually was. After about a month, it stopped. Just like that. One evening the light didn't appear, and then it never did again. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't look at that hill without feeling watched. I'd walk past the pond and feel something heavy in my chest, like something was pressing against me from far away. It stayed with me for years. Eventually, we grew up. I moved away. Life went on. I went to school in a bigger town, got used to noise and crowds, and people who didn't know who I was. The village felt smaller each time I visited. The memories faded a little, but never disappeared. Years later, I came back for a funeral. One of the older men from the village had passed. He'd been in his 80s, lived in the same house his whole life. After the burial, I ended up talking to a few of the neighbors outside the church. We shared coffee and pastries in the little hall beside the graveyard. It was strange being back. Everything looked the same, just smaller. The old house on the hill came up in conversation. Someone mentioned the town was thinking of finally tearing it down, maybe salvaging the barn if it was still safe. Most of the younger people didn't even know the story behind it, and the older folks didn't care to talk much. But one woman, a cousin of the man who died, said something that stuck with me. She said that decades ago, before the war, a man lived in that house who used to be a poacher. He worked odd jobs in the forest. They said he'd go out at night with a lantern, trap small animals, sometimes skin them on the spot. He lived alone, had a bad leg, so he always crouched or sat when he worked. After the war, he didn't come back. Some people said he died out there in the woods. Others thought he moved away, but no one ever saw him again. The house just sat there, empty, falling apart slowly. That didn't explain what we saw, not exactly, but it gave me something to hold on to. Looking back now, I don't think it was anything supernatural. I don't think it was a ghost or a spirit. I think someone was up there, a real person, someone who didn't want to be seen, someone who knew how to move through the woods and stay quiet. Maybe they had their reasons for being there. Maybe it was just someone hiding or squatting or remembering a place that used to be home. The footprints in the snow were real. The packed down ground, the broken tiles, all of it was real. The light was real. I saw it. We both did. And the feeling of being watched, that was real too. I don't think about it every day anymore. But some nights, if I'm in a quiet place, if the snow is falling just right, I remember that light by the tree and how it stayed there night after night, without a sound, without a trace. And I still wonder, who was it really? And why did they stop coming? Maybe we'll never know. But I'm certain now it wasn't just in our heads. Something happened that winter on the hill. We were too young to understand it, too small to do anything about it, and everyone else just laughed it off. But I remember. I always will. It was sometime in the fall. I remember that clearly because the leaves had just started to change color, and I had to start wearing a hoodie to school in the mornings. I was about 13, maybe 14, old enough to be left alone most of the time, but still young enough that I didn't really think twice about doing dumb stuff, like using the bathroom without turning on the lights. The upstairs bathroom in our house sat on the back corner, and its small window looked straight out into the backyard. Past the grass and a small retaining wall, the land dipped down a little and then started climbing again, forming a long, wooded hill that led up to another development, one of those newer ones that had started to get built just before the housing crash hit. There were only a few houses up there, kind of scattered. You couldn't really see them through the trees, but at night you could catch porch lights or the occasional motion light flickering on through the branches. I knew the woods well. I used to ride my bike through the trails with some neighborhood friends, and we'd throw little green army men into the creek and try to build dams out of mud. It wasn't scary to me then, just background noise to everyday life. That night, I was feeling lazy. I'd already brushed my teeth, and after staying up too late watching some dumb YouTube videos on my phone, I finally got up to pee before bed. I didn't bother with the bathroom light. The hallway light was still on, and that usually gave enough of a glow through the open door for me to see what I was doing. I pushed the door halfway closed so it wouldn't be too bright, shuffled in, lifted the seat, and just started peeing. Now, from where I was standing, I could look up and out the small bathroom window. It was one of those tall, narrow ones, frosted at the bottom, but clear at the top half. You had to be the right height to look out of it comfortably. And I was. So while I stood there half asleep and going about my business, my eyes were kind of just resting on the dark outline of the trees beyond the yard. That's when I saw it. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. A light, but not a sharp one. Not like a flashlight beam pointed at me. More like a soft, indirect glow, like someone was pointing a flashlight away from me, but standing just far enough up the hill that I could still catch the edge of it. It wasn't moving, just sitting there. kind of flickering, kind of steady, and high up, maybe shoulder height or above. I frowned, still peeing, still looking. It stayed there. I finished up, flushed, and leaned on the windowsill a little. The light was still there. I figured it might be one of those automatic floodlights from one of the newer houses up the hill. Maybe someone's dog had run out and tripped the motion sensor. Or a deer. We had deer all the time back there. But even then, those lights usually turned off after a minute or two. This one didn't. It just hung there, almost like it was watching. And then it moved. Not fast. It didn't dart or wave around. It just slowly turned, the way you'd expect someone holding a flashlight to turn their wrist like they were now facing me. The light didn't get brighter, just more direct, more focused. It narrowed and sharpened like someone had taken the edge of a wide beam and pinched it into a point. It was shining directly at me now, still distant, still soft in a way, but very clearly centered on my bathroom window. I could see the glow of it reflecting faintly on the glass, even though the rest of the room stayed dim. That part really freaked me out. A flashlight should have lit the wall or my arm or the mirror behind me, but this one didn't. It was like it was only lighting the window and only from the outside. I stepped back a bit. My heart started pounding, but I tried to talk myself down. Maybe it was some kid messing around with the spotlight. Maybe it was a reflection from a car coming down one of the gravel roads up the hill. Maybe it was nothing, but it kept getting closer. I don't mean the light started bobbing up and down like someone was walking with it. I mean it started moving directly toward the window. Steady, like it was gliding through the trees. No shake, no stumble, no shifting shadows. Just this focused white light slowly crossing a quarter mile of woods, uphill and downhill, until it looked like it was floating directly in front of me, just beyond the glass. I froze. It didn't make sense. The hill outside was steep, the woods thick, the ground uneven. You couldn't move through that fast without falling over, especially not with a light held that steady. There weren't trails right in that part either. And still, the beam didn't waver once. I didn't breathe. I stood there staring, waiting for it to flicker or fade or reveal a shape behind it. Nothing. Just a white light locked on my window. I felt my hands go cold. Then I snapped out of it and bolted. I hit the wall switch. The bathroom light came on. The second it did, the outside light vanished. Gone. Not dimmed or turned away, just gone. Like someone had flipped it off at the exact same instant I turned mine on. I stared at the glass, chest heaving, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The bathroom was fully lit now. Every corner visible. The window a blank square showing nothing but blackness beyond. I waited. Maybe 5 minutes. Didn't even move. Just stood there with my hand still on the light switch, waiting for the light to come back. Waiting for some hint of a person or a shadow or a branch moving. Nothing. Finally, I stepped back to the window and looked harder. Still nothing. No movement. No light. Just trees. I went to my room, locked the door even though I knew it wouldn't help, and sat on the edge of my bed until it got light outside. I didn't sleep. I didn't even lie down. I kept thinking about how the light moved. Not like a person. Not like a flashlight. Like something that didn't care about the terrain or trees or logic. But I reminded myself, no ghosts. No aliens. Nothing like that. I don't believe in that stuff. And yet, the way that light acted wasn't something I could explain. The next day after school, I went out into the backyard and looked up at the bathroom window. Then I turned and faced the woods. I tried to retrace where the light would have been. I walked across the yard, through the trees, uphill, until I hit the ridge where the second development started. It was a longer walk than I'd remembered. Quarter mile, easy. Steep, full of rocks and roots. You'd have to be pretty fast and pretty crazy to run that in the dark with a flashlight pointed straight ahead the whole time. There were no trails through that section of woods. No sign that anyone had walked there recently. No crushed leaves, no footprints, no broken branches. Just stillness. I walked back the same way, slower this time. I looked up at the window again. The angle was weird. You'd have to hold a light at shoulder height and be about 6 feet tall to even hit that window directly from that distance. And to move that smoothly and steadily, I couldn't picture it. I told myself it was probably a hunter, maybe using night vision or some high-powered light. But even that didn't explain how steady it was or why it disappeared the second I turned my bathroom light on. I didn't tell my parents, didn't tell my friends. I didn't want to sound crazy. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing like it ever happened again. I still use that bathroom every day. I always turn the light on after that. Always shut the door behind me. I never saw another light in the woods like that one. I never heard a sound. Nothing ever showed up in the yard or on the security cameras my dad eventually installed, probably just to watch for deer eating the garden. But I never forgot it, and I've never explained it. Whatever it was that night, it wasn't just a flashlight. It wasn't some kid messing around in the woods. And it wasn't a ghost or a monster or anything out of a movie. It was real. It happened. And that's what makes it worse. Because sometimes the scariest things don't come from stories. They come from standing alone in the dark, looking out a window and watching something look back, and realizing there's no good reason for it to be there. I don't know how creepy anyone else would find this, but I remember the moment so vividly that even now, over a decade later, it still gives me the heavy feeling in my chest when I think about it. Not fear exactly, but the kind of unease that settles deep, like a chill that gets into your bones and doesn't leave no matter how warm it is around you. It was winter in Norway. I must have been around 10 or 11. That weird age where you think you're old enough to handle things, but you still don't really understand how the world works. We lived in a small town, nothing too far from the woods. The kind of place where you could walk to school, walk to your friends' houses, and pretty much know everyone by name. Our school was in the middle of a quiet neighborhood, not far from the main road, but surrounded by a good patch of open space, trees, some scrubby hills, and then flat frozen fields stretching out to the sides. That day, I was walking over to my friend's place. We hung out a lot back then, especially in the winter when you couldn't do much outdoors except sledding or just aimlessly wandering around until your feet got too cold to keep going. To get to his house from mine, the fastest way was across the schoolyard. Not through the buildings, just straight over the wide paved space behind classrooms. In summer, kids played football there. In winter, it usually lay empty, with patches of dirty snow and ice crusting the ground. It wasn't anything strange to take that shortcut. It saved 5 or 10 minutes, and I'd done it plenty of times before. That day, it was around 2 in the afternoon, but it looked like twilight. If you've never lived up here, it's hard to explain the way the light hits in winter. It's not quite day, not quite night. Everything gets this washed out gray-blue tint, like the world stuck in a fading photograph. The streetlights hadn't turned on yet, and the sun was nowhere to be seen, hidden behind clouds that had that flat white thickness to them, like they were pressed right down onto the sky. The cold was sharp, the kind that pinches your face and makes your breath fog out in front of you. I remember the sound my boots made, thin ice cracking underfoot with every step on the sidewalk. I had my hood up, but not tied, and my hands shoved in my jacket pockets. I was walking with my head down mostly, just trying to avoid slipping. There were little frost-covered tufts of grass poking out through cracks in the pavement. No one else was out. That wasn't weird in itself. It was a school day, and by that hour, most people were either indoors or still at work. It was dead quiet, except for the wind. That was the first thing I noticed. The wind sounded strange. Normally it rustled through the trees or made a low whistling noise past corners and fences. But this time it felt like it was pushing at me. Not hard, but just steady enough that I kept leaning slightly forward without meaning to. Then I stepped into the open area of the schoolyard, and I stopped dead. At first, I didn't even process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. There were birds. Everywhere. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. It's hard to guess numbers like that when your brain is trying to catch up to what your eyes are looking at. But they were on the roof of the school, covering it like a black sheet. They were on the railings, the fences, the windowsills, lined up in rows. Some on the ground, some perched on the goalposts at the far end of the yard. And they were all still, not moving, not calling, not flapping, just there. Crows. I remember that specifically because they're easy to recognize. Black feathers, that sharp shape to their beaks, and the way they always look like they're thinking. These weren't just a few that happened to land at the same place. This looked deliberate, like someone had dumped them there and told them to stay. I stopped just short of the yard, maybe a few meters from the open part where the school building started. I remember the cold seeping into my shoes as I stood there too long, not walking forward, not turning back, just staring. The sky above was empty. No birds flying, no clouds moving. It was like the whole world had paused. And the thing was, none of them were moving, not even twitching, not pecking at the ground, not hopping between spots, not cawing. Just sitting, watching. I couldn't even tell if they were breathing. I shifted my foot, and one of the chunks of ice under it cracked louder than I expected. That sharp sound echoed slightly off the school building. And that's when a few of them turned their heads. Just their heads. Towards me. That did it. I didn't scream. I didn't even run at first. I just backed up a step, then another, and then turned and started walking fast. Too fast for it to be normal, not quite a jog, but fast enough that my heart started thudding in my ears. My hands were still in my pockets, but I clenched them into fists as I went. I cut across the snow-covered grass toward the longer road to my friend's place. I didn't look back, not even once. I walked the rest of the way with my face down and my ears burning with cold and adrenaline. Every few seconds I thought I heard wings behind me, but when I'd glance quickly to the side, there was nothing. Just wind and trees and the occasional crunch of snow under my boots. When I got to my friend's place, I didn't tell him about it. Not because I thought he wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to talk about it. Like saying it out loud would make it worse somehow. I stayed there for a few hours, playing games, eating snacks, just normal stuff. When I walked home later that evening, I went the long way again. I didn't even glance toward the school. Over the next few days, I kept thinking I should go check, to see if they were still there. But something stopped me. Every time I passed anywhere near the school, whether I was walking to the store or being driven past it, I avoided looking directly at the building. Not out of fear exactly, but some deeper instinct. Like when you know there's a hornet nest in the shed and you just stop opening the shed altogether. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. A few days later, I forced myself to walk past it in the daylight. Bright, clear morning, sun reflecting off the snow. Everything looked normal. Empty yard, clean roof, no birds. I stood at the edge of the school grounds again, same spot where I'd frozen up before. And I remember thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I'd thought. Maybe they were just migrating or something, and I'd caught them during a weird moment. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. You don't imagine hundreds of silent birds watching you in perfect stillness. You don't make up that kind of quiet. Later that week, I asked my older brother if he'd seen anything weird around the school. He said no, and I didn't bring it up again. Years passed. I went to another school later, then moved to another part of the country for work. That old neighborhood is still there. I haven't been back to that school since the last day I attended it, but I know the shortcut path I used to take still exists. I've seen it on satellite maps. Same layout, same playground equipment, same building. But the weird thing is every now and then, especially when winter rolls around and the light gets low and the sky goes that same gray blue, I get that same feeling again. The kind that starts between your shoulder blades and works its way into your stomach. Once when I was around 20, I had to visit someone in that town for a family thing. It was late January, snow everywhere. I decided to take a walk in the morning before the visit, just for the nostalgia. I ended up near the school without meaning to. And before I even realized where I was standing at the same edge of the yard where I'd frozen all those years before. No birds, nothing unusual, but I still didn't step forward. I just stood there, stared for a few minutes, then turned and walked away again, this time slower, older, but with the same chill crawling up my spine. I don't have a good explanation for it. I don't think anyone could explain something like that, and I don't think it needs one. Sometimes things just happen. Not supernatural, not ghosts or demons or anything like that. Just nature being wrong, out of place. And in those moments, all the little instincts we have left over from something older and more primitive kick in. You know when something's off. You feel it. That was the day I learned to trust that feeling. And I never took the shortcut again. I don't talk about this often, mostly because I still don't really know what to make of it. It's one of those stories that sticks in the back of your mind and just won't leave you alone, even if it doesn't make any sense. I've told it a few times to people who know me well, usually when the topic of Ouija boards comes up. I guess it's become more of a warning than anything else. I'm not saying I believe in all that ghost and spirit stuff, but I don't go near those things anymore. I've had enough. This happened when I was a teenager. I was about 16 at the time, living in a part of the city that wasn't exactly known for being the safest. There were plenty of rundown buildings, trash in the gutters, graffiti on every concrete wall, and people you try not to make eye contact with. The streets always felt dirty, like no matter how much it rained, nothing ever really got washed away. Still, it was home. I didn't have the best family situation. My parents were together, but always yelling at each other. It never got physical, but there was a kind of tension in the air all the time, like a stretched rubber band that was ready to snap. Home wasn't a peaceful place. So after school, I'd do anything to avoid going back there right away. I wasn't alone in that. I had two close friends, Jake and Kyle, who also didn't have much waiting for them at home. We all sort of gravitated toward each other like people who shared a kind of quiet understanding. We used to hang out at this big cemetery about 20 minutes from school. It wasn't the kind of place most people would go to relax, but for us, it was quiet. Peaceful even. The gates were never really locked unless there had been some kind of trouble, and the security guard didn't care much as long as you weren't causing problems or trashing the place. There was a small, tucked-away spot deep in the middle where the older graves were. Moss-covered stones, some of them broken or tilted over. Names worn down to nothing. We picked that spot one day and just kept coming back. It became ours. At first, we just used the place to smoke cigarettes, weed stolen from our parents, or talk about whatever was bothering us that week. Kyle usually drove us there in his dad's old truck, a rattling piece of junk that somehow kept running. Jake and I would walk or ride bikes if we had to, but Kyle was the one with wheels, so we depended on him a lot. I guess that's why we always met up after school and rode together if we could. Over time, our hangouts started to shift. Maybe we got bored of just sitting around, or maybe we were looking for something more exciting. Someone brought up the idea of trying a seance, probably Jake. He was always into weird stuff. Books about the afterlife, horror movies, videos about urban legends, and secret government experiments. I didn't think much of it at the time. We were kids, trying to freak each other out. That was all. The first time we tried it, we just sat in a circle with some candles and held hands like we'd seen in movies. Nothing happened, of course. The wind blew, trees creaked, bugs buzzed in our ears. But no voices, no flickering lights, no signs from the beyond. We did it a few more times out of boredom, but we never got any results. Still, it became a kind of tradition. Like, hey, let's go to the graveyard, light some candles, and pretend we know what we're doing. Stupid, harmless fun. That's all it ever was. Then one day, Kyle showed up with a Ouija board. It wasn't one of those glow-in-the-dark novelty boards you find at toy stores. It looked old, really old. Wooden, with letters and numbers carved into it, not just printed. The planchette was this little heart-shaped thing made of dark, polished wood with a cloudy plastic window in the middle. I remember the way it fell to my hands, cold, even though it had been in his backpack. Kyle said he found it in the attic of his uncle's house. We didn't ask questions. We were too curious. That night, we waited until it was dark. The cemetery looked different in the dark. Not scary exactly, but heavy. The air felt thicker, and the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It pressed against your ears, made your own breath sound too loud. We sat in our usual spot under a big oak tree whose roots had torn up some of the old graves. We lit 3 candles and put the board between us. It started like any other time. We each put 2 fingers on the planchette and asked if anyone was there. Nothing happened. We tried again, and after a few minutes, the planchette started to move. Slowly at first, then more smoothly. I figured one of us was pushing it just to mess around. We spelled out a few stupid words, stuff like hello and yes. Then Jake got the idea to ask it when he would die. I remember laughing. I think we all did. It was the kind of edgy question teenagers ask to show they don't care about anything. But the planchette moved quickly, faster than before. It spelled out 1WEEK. We sat there in silence for a minute. Then someone laughed again. I think it was Kyle. We all joined in. It was creepy, sure, but still a joke to us. Jake pretended to be scared and clutched his chest like he was about to keel over. I rolled my eyes. We packed up, blew out the candles, and walked back to Kyle's truck. Over the next few days, nothing happened. We joked about the 1 week thing a few times, but no one really took it seriously. Jake seemed a little quieter than usual, though. I figured he was just having a rough week. I knew he had a hard time at home. His dad was gone, and his mom worked long hours. We didn't talk about that stuff much, but we knew enough to give each other space. A week passed, almost to the day. It was a Friday. I remember because school had just let out, and I had a math test I was glad to be done with. I took my usual route toward the cemetery. I didn't have any solid plans, but I figured I'd see if the guys were there. It had been a few days since we'd all met up. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The cemetery gates were open, same as always. I walked the path past the newer graves, past the rows of identical headstones, until I reached our spot. I saw someone standing there near the tree. It was Jake. He looked like he'd been running. His shirt was wrinkled, and his face was pale. His hands were shaking. I remember the way he kept looking over his shoulder like someone was chasing him. I jogged over to him, my heart starting to race. I thought something had happened. He looked me dead in the eye, his mouth open, chest heaving. He was breathing hard, and he looked terrified. Not just scared, but like something had shaken him to his core. I didn't know what to say. He pointed in the direction we usually came from, toward Kyle's house, and then took off. I didn't follow. I don't know why. I think I was too confused. He'd said something, but it didn't make sense. Something about Kyle in an accident. Something about needing help. He told me to run to Kyle's house and tell his parents. So I did. I remember sprinting down the cracked sidewalks, dodging trash cans, jumping over curbs. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop. Kyle's house was about 15 minutes away by foot, but I must have made it there in under 10. I turned the corner and saw 2 cop cars parked in front of his place. That's when my stomach dropped. I ran up the steps and pushed open the front door without knocking. I didn't even think. I was shouting as soon as I got inside, asking if Kyle was okay, saying I'd seen Jake at the graveyard and that he'd told me something bad had happened. And then everything stopped because Kyle was standing right there in the hallway, a bruise on his forehead, a bandage on his arm, but alive. He looked confused. So did his parents. So did the cops. I stood there, gasping for air, unable to speak. My brain couldn't catch up. Kyle asked me what I was talking about. I tried to explain, tried to say that Jake had told me there'd been an accident, that he'd sent me here to get help. But Kyle just stared at me. Then one of the officers pulled Kyle's parents aside and spoke in a low voice. I heard just enough. There had been an accident. Kyle had been driving home from school. Jake had gotten in the car with him last minute, and some guy blew a red light at an intersection and hit the passenger side. Hard. Kyle walked away with bruises. Jake didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I kept going over it in my head, trying to make sense of it. I had seen Jake. He'd talked to me. He'd looked panicked, but alive. But according to the police report, he had died on impact. He was already gone by the time I saw him. I tried to tell myself that maybe I'd been confused, that maybe it hadn't really been Jake I saw, that maybe it was shock or grief or my brain playing tricks on me. But I knew what I saw. I knew it was him. I remembered his clothes, the way his voice cracked when he spoke, the way his eyes looked. I never went back to that cemetery. Not once. I avoided the entire neighborhood for years. Kyle moved away a year later. His family couldn't handle staying in that house after what happened. We lost touch after that. I don't blame him. I haven't touched a Ouija board since that night. I don't even like being in the same room as one. I don't believe in ghosts, not really. But I believe something happened that night. Something I can't explain. And when people bring up the idea of using one, just for fun, just to see what happens, I always tell them this story. Not to scare them, not to be dramatic, but because sometimes, even if it is just a game, you still end up getting an answer. And sometimes that answer turns out to be right. In high school, I wasn't the kind of kid who believed in urban legends. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't watch ghost hunting shows, and I didn't think stories like Slender Man or the Mothman were real. I was a pretty normal teenager, busy with school, hanging out with friends, playing video games, and listening to music while doing homework late into the night. I was logical. I needed evidence to believe in something. But there's one story that changed everything for me, Not in a supernatural way, not in a spiritual way, but in a deeply human, grounded, terrifying way. This is the story of OM. It started when I was a freshman, around 2007. I had a good group of friends, Steve, Blake, Mark, and a few others I've since lost touch with. Steve was the kind of guy who had a story for everything. Most of them were harmless. Funny things his older brother Tim did in college, strange local news stories, bizarre stuff he read online. But one story stood out above the rest. I remember exactly where I was when he told us. We were sitting outside the library after school, waiting for our rides. It was cloudy, which was rare in Southern California. That kind of thick, gray cloud cover that flattens everything out and makes the shadows feel longer than they are. He started the story by saying something like, "My brother had this really weird thing happen when he was in college." Still freaks him out. He said Tim was going to school in New Hampshire. I don't know the name of the school, but somewhere remote enough that there were woods between towns and long stretches of highway where you didn't see other cars for miles. That night, Tim and one of his best friends had a craving for Dunkin' Donuts at around 2 in the morning. Steve said it like it was just a weird college thing, getting donuts in the middle of the night, driving across state lines like it was nothing. From what I understood, the closest Dunkin' was a decent drive away, and to get there they had to take a narrow, winding highway through forested hills. It was late fall and cold, with frost building up on the windshield. They got their donuts and coffee, joked around, and started the drive back. That's when it happened. Steve said that on the return trip, as they were cruising back through the dark woods, a red compact car pulled onto the road in front of them. It wasn't some brand new sedan or SUV, more like an older model, small, maybe Japanese or Korean made, with a faded paint job. The car didn't have any obvious model badges or logos, just blank metal where the emblems should have been. But the one thing that stood out, the thing Tim apparently swore to, was the license plate. Instead of normal numbers or estate design, it had only 2 letters, a black O and a green M. Steve called it OM. That's the name that stuck. At first, Tim and his friend didn't think much of it. It was weird, sure, but they figured it was just a local with a custom plate or a novelty tag. Then things started to get strange. Tim noticed that his phone, which had full bars earlier, suddenly dropped to no service. Dead. His friend's phone, too. Gone. No signal in either direction. The jazz station they were listening to cut out and started playing something else. Not Static, not a commercial, but Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, a grunge anthem on a station that only ever played Coltrane or Miles Davis. It didn't make sense. Still, these were college kids. Weird coincidences happen all the time. Bad reception in the woods? Normal. A radio station glitch? Happens. But the way Steve told it, what shook Tim up was what the OM car did next. They slowed down. Not because they were scared yet, but because Tim was tired and he didn't want to tailgate. But as they let their car ease up, OM slowed down too. Exactly in sync. No delay. No hesitation. It was like OM had a mirror on them, adjusting speed with surgical precision. Tim tested it. Slowed a little more. OM did the same. Sped up. OM matched. There was no attempt to lose them. No turn off. No acceleration into the distance. Just the same speed. Always the same distance. By this point, Tim was wide awake. They didn't say anything to each other. At least Steve didn't mention it, but the panic was setting in. They saw a bend in the road coming up, one of those curves that makes the forest close and tight and hides whatever's ahead. As OM disappeared around the curve, Tim made a choice. He stopped the car. They just sat there. He didn't know how long. Steve said Tim guessed it was about 20 minutes. Long enough for the adrenaline to hit, fade, then hit again. Long enough to question what they were doing out there, how far they were from town, how long it would take for a tow truck to reach them if anything went wrong. The road was silent. No other cars came by. Just the sound of the engine ticking as it cooled and the crunch of leaves shifting in the wind. Eventually, they convinced themselves to keep going. Maybe OM had gone. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. They eased around the curve, inching forward, and there he was. OM same distance, same position, waiting. That was enough. They didn't stop again. Tim stayed behind OM for the rest of the drive, never speeding up, never falling too far back. Just followed as safely as possible until they hit a fork in the road. One path led toward town, toward the college. The other went deeper into the woods. OM took the path into the woods. Tim and his friend went home. They never saw OM again. Now, when Steve told us this, I'll admit I didn't believe him. It sounded like a spooky campfire story. Two college kids, a mysterious car, a long stretch of highway. It had all the ingredients of a good lie. But Steve wasn't trying to scare us. He didn't lean in and say boo. He just told it straight, like he was confused by it, unsure if Tim had made it up or not. That made it worse in a way. There was no punchline, just silence. That would have been the end of it. Just another story among friends, except that something happened about a year later that I'll never forget. I was doing homework in my room one night with the radio on. It was a local AM talk station I used to listen to while working on assignments. They would talk politics, news, traffic, boring stuff, but familiar. It was maybe 10:30 at night, and I was half listening when the host cut in with a local bulletin. There had been a murder in a nearby county. Nothing too specific, just a violent incident with one witness. The host described the scene, then mentioned that the witness saw a car leaving. A red compact car, no model mentioned, but the license plate was described clearly, a black O and a green M. I froze. I remember the sound of my pencil falling on the desk. It was like the air in the room got thinner. I couldn't breathe right. I didn't say anything, didn't call anyone. Just sat there, staring at the wall, thinking about what Steve had said a year before. Could it really be the same car? How could that be possible? That was in New Hampshire. This was Southern California. The next day at school, I ran into Steve between classes. He looked pale. I didn't even have to say anything. He just asked, "Did you hear that report last night?" We stood there for a few seconds, both realizing the same thing at the same time. Neither of us was crazy. One was real. He was out there, and he had crossed the country. I started to think back. What if OM was more than just a creepy driver? What if he was a drifter, a killer, someone who changed locations constantly to avoid being caught? The custom plate, the missing car logos, the erratic behavior. What if it was all designed to confuse law enforcement, to keep his identity hidden? I tried to forget about it. For a while I did. Life moved on. We graduated. People went to college, got jobs. I stopped thinking about OM, mostly because thinking about him meant realizing he could be anywhere. That kind of fear gets into your bones if you let it. Then, in May, years later, I got a message from Blake, one of the guys from our group back in high school. He wasn't the dramatic type. In fact, he was the most level-headed person I knew. But his message was short and direct. I saw OM. He said he dropped off his girlfriend late that night, around 2 a.m., and had decided to take a shortcut home through a canyon highway. It was one of those dark, narrow roads with barely any lighting, only reflectors and your high beams to guide you. Halfway through the canyon, a red compact car pulled in front of him. Same description, same plate, black O green M. Blake had heard the stories. He'd been there when Steve told us the first time. He said he instantly got cold. Not physically, but in that deep, skin-prickling way where you know something is wrong and your body is telling you to run. But he couldn't run. He was in a car. OM kept his distance. Never sped away. Never slowed too much. Just stayed in front of him, like a predator letting you know you're being watched. When the canyon finally opened up and Blake saw signs of the city again, OM did a U-turn. Just turned around in the middle of the road and drove back the way he came. Blake didn't follow. He went straight home and sat in his driveway for half an hour before going inside. He said he didn't even tell his girlfriend. He just couldn't process it. That was the last confirmed sighting any of us had. But it wasn't the only one. A few months later, someone on a Reddit thread, I posted the story to mention seeing OM in a completely different part of the country. Another red compact car, another quiet highway, another license plate with those impossible letters. I don't know who OM is. I don't know if he's one man or multiple people copying an idea. But I know this. He's real. I've never seen him myself, but I know he's out there. I know that someone... I live in a church, or more accurately, what used to be a church. It was built sometime in the mid-1700s, and as far as I know, it was one of the first churches in this part of the state. The building was converted into a house sometime in the 1930s, but they never moved the cemetery out front. There's a small iron fence that wraps around the graveyard, right next to the road, and from my upstairs bedroom window, you can see all the stones clearly, some of them tilted from the years, some of them unreadable. We're talking old names, faded engravings, even a couple of cracked headstones that were probably hit by snowplows or falling branches over the years. People always say living next to a graveyard would freak them out. I usually tell them it's not as scary as it sounds. The truth is, I barely notice it anymore. But there's a difference between what you tell other people and what you actually feel when you live in a place like this long enough. It gets under your skin in a way that's hard to explain. The quietness is different. It's not peace. It's something else. And it's not just the cemetery. The church-turned house is a whole other beast. You can still see the bones of what it used to be. The ceilings are high in some places for no reason. The floors creak even when you're not walking on them. There's an old crawl space under the stairs that's just barely big enough to store anything, and the basement is the kind of place you avoid unless you have to go down there. It always smells like old stone, like wet earth that never fully dries. My bedroom is upstairs in what used to be a kind of open loft area. The walls are slanted where the roof comes down low, and the floorboards don't match, like they use whatever scrap wood was lying around when they remodeled. I've lived here my whole life. My parents still live here too, and they don't think there's anything strange about the place. But I've had experiences in this house that I can't explain, not in a magical or ghostly way, but in a way that makes you feel like something's wrong and you can't do anything about it. Something you have to live with. It started with little things. They always do. One day, I walked into my room and noticed that my phone charger wasn't where I left it. I normally plug it into the outlet beside my bed, snake the cord through the side table, and drape it on top so I can grab it easily. But that day it was gone. I found it under a pile of dirty clothes at the foot of my bed. The strange part wasn't just that it had been moved. The cord had been completely disconnected from the brick, and both pieces were under different shirts. I chalked it up to me, maybe tossing clothes around without noticing. Maybe it got yanked somehow. Whatever. I put it back the way it always was. Didn't think about it again until the next day, when the same thing happened. And the day after that, again. Each time, it was the same. The cord unplugged from the wall, the brick and wire separated, hidden under dirty clothes that I swear I hadn't touched. By the third day, I was annoyed. I bent down to plug the brick back into the wall beside my bed, and it was harder to do than usual. The socket is loose, and I had to jam it in a little harder. My phone was still in my other hand, and I must have touched the screen by accident because I felt the familiar buzz of the haptic feedback a few times. When I finally got the charger plugged in, I looked at the screen. The phone had opened the call app. I didn't even know it was possible, but it had somehow started to dial a number. 3 sixes were already punched in. 666. I stared at the screen for a long time before hitting cancel. It felt like the kind of moment that should have meant something more, but there was no other explanation. I figured I must have hit the numbers by mistake while holding the phone awkwardly. Still, I remember that buzzing. I remember it didn't feel random. It felt like the screen was reacting to actual pressure, like I wasn't holding it the way I usually do. Like it had a mind of its own for a second. A few months later, I was upstairs in the bathroom. It was the middle of summer, one of those days where the heat clings to you and doesn't let go, even indoors. The upstairs bathroom is small, just a sink, toilet, and a cramped shower. Right outside, it is a hallway that leads to my parents' bedroom and the spare room. That hallway is narrow and runs about 15 feet, just wide enough for one person to walk through comfortably. The light switch is at the far end, so most of the time you end up walking through it in the dark until you reach your room. That day, when I opened the bathroom door to step into the hallway, I saw a man standing at the far end. He wasn't doing anything, just standing still, turned halfway toward me. He was wearing dark clothes, and I could see his shape clearly against the light that bled through the doorway behind him. He stood there for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, looking directly at me. Then he turned and walked into the spare room at the end of the hall. I remember not moving for a full minute. My brain didn't catch up with what my eyes had just seen. There was no one else in the house. The front door was locked. I checked everything, every room, every window. The spare room was empty when I looked. There was no sound, no trace of anyone having been there. But I know what I saw. I've had dreams in this house that stick with me long after I wake up. Not just normal dreams, these are different. One night, I dreamed that I was lying in bed exactly as I actually was and that I couldn't move. It felt like I was awake but paralyzed. In the dream, three little girls in white dresses stood beside my bed, shoulder to shoulder. They just stood there, facing me, watching. They didn't move or speak. They just stared. I couldn't do anything. I wanted to move, but my body wouldn't listen. The dream lasted the entire night, or at least it felt that way. I'd wake up in the dream, thinking I'd escaped, only to find myself still stuck, still watched. When I finally did wake up for real, I was soaked in sweat and couldn't shake the image for days. I don't remember any faces, just the shape of the dresses, the pale legs, bare feet on the wooden floor. Years ago, I was dating a girl who used to stay over sometimes. We'd lie in bed and listen to music or watch something on my laptop. One night, we were half asleep when we both heard a whistle. It wasn't a random wind through the windows sound. It was short, deliberate, two rising notes, like someone trying to get your attention. We both heard it. We sat up. I got out of bed and looked around the room, checked the windows. No one was there. It happened 2 more times during the span of our relationship. Each time, same whistle, same room, same situation, quiet, late, no one else in the house. I never told her how much it bothered me. I acted like it was nothing, but the sound had a weight to it, like it wasn't just in the air, it was meant to be heard. Late one night, I was lying on my bed watching TV. I had flipped around and was lying with my head at the foot of the bed, feet near the headboard. The acoustic guitar I keep next to the dresser was leaning against the wall, just beside me. I wasn't touching it, wasn't near it. Out of nowhere, the strings strummed. Not hard, not loud, but enough to make a sound. It wasn't a bump or a thud. It was a strum. Full. Clear. The kind of sound you only get when fingers drag across all 6 strings at once. I sat up instantly. The guitar hadn't fallen. It was still upright. There was nothing nearby that could have hit it. I remember the way the air felt in that moment, like something had just moved through the room and left. Another time, I ran upstairs quickly to grab something from my room. I sat down on my bed to check a text message. I hadn't been up there more than a minute. While sitting there, I felt the bed shift beside me. I actually felt the mattress lower, like someone had flopped down right next to me. At the same time, I heard the sound of air being pushed out of the mattress and felt a light breeze move across my skin. It was as real as anything I've ever felt. There was no one there. After all these things started piling up, I decided to buy a digital voice recorder. I had read about them online, how they can pick up sounds you can't hear in real time. I didn't expect anything, but I figured it was worth a shot. One night, I sat in my room and just started asking questions. I asked about the whistling. I asked if there was anyone else in the room. I asked if they liked my guitar, since I had heard it strum before. When I played it back, there was silence at first. But then, after I asked about the whistling, I heard the same 2-note whistle again, loud and clear on the recording. I hadn't heard it while I was speaking, but there it was. Then, after the question about the guitar, there was a faint female giggle. It was quick, soft, and unmistakable. I froze. My hands actually shook when I set the recorder down. But that wasn't the worst part. I went down the hall and stood in the doorway of the spare room. The same room where I saw the man walk in months earlier. I hit record and started talking again, asking simple questions. It was dead quiet. I didn't hear anything in person, but when I played that part back, everything changed. I heard a man's voice. Not words, just low grunts, like a heavy man try to respond without forming full sentences. Just a huh, or something close to it. Then, when I asked for a sign, a knock or a tap, there was tapping. 3 slow taps on the TV in the corner of the room. Then more. I asked yes or no questions and got responses in taps. I couldn't keep going. I turned it off. I deleted the audio. I never used the recorder again. That was the end of it for a while, but the memory never went away. I never told anyone the full story, not the way I'm telling it now. Not because I think anyone would call me crazy, but because I don't want to hear myself say it out loud. That makes it more real.